Gliding along, the Batman suit 2.0 was very stealthy, and Luke reached Stark Tower without drawing attention. Looking at Stark Tower, which was mostly dark except for the top, Luke chuckled and descended. When he slowly touched down on the landing pad, a gentle male voice rang out. "Mr. Batman?" Luke nodded. "Jarvis, long time no see. Can you stop with the probe? Tony hasn't given you any orders." Jarvis wasn't human, so had no face to feel thick-skinned. Hearing Luke's words, it simply said calmly, "Sir instructed that it's not possible to cancel the security check on your armor, in case someone impersonates you." Luke chuckled inwardly. "The master is shameless, and you're even worse." He didn't waste any time. "Is Tony here?" Jarvis said, "Yes, I've informed Sir that you're visiting. Tell him to put on his newest suit before he comes out." After saying that, Luke fell silent. Jarvis was really useful. He was much smarter than Little Snail. But Luke didn't mind that his smart program was a little stupid. The most unforgivable crime would be if he created an uncontrollable program like Skynet. If the system judged that he should be held responsible for some of the bad things done by Skynet, it wouldn't be impossible for him to be punished with the classic obliteration. As he thought that, a gold and red figure flew out of the passage on the top floor and stopped 5 meters in front of Luke. A certain flashy fellow didn't land, but hovered high above Luke. "What? You want me to go and save the world again?" Luke was amused. In recent months, the #1 hero who was most enthusiastic about maintaining world peace was in fact Iron Man, and part of it had to do with wanting to steal Batman's thunder. So, the guy was clearly just asking the question to show off. Luke used his vision to operate the virtual screen on the mask. The cape on his back quickly disappeared to reveal the Batman suit 2.0 in its entirety. Tony, who hadn't stopped scanning the suit, frowned. He felt that the Batman suit looked familiar in many respects, and he couldn't help but ask, "Are you imitating me?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Tony hadn't expected Luke to be so blunt. He was stunned. "Are you serious?" Luke said, "Yes." Tony asked, "Why?" Luke decided the tycoon should be mentally prepared a little first. "I saw your performance at the hearing this morning. I think I should give you a warning." Tony was suspicious. "Don't tell me, you're in love with that senator?" Luke remained unmoved. "No, I just want to tell you something." "Tony, what?" Luke said, "You're not the only superhero in this world." Tony had a strange expression on his face. He felt that these words were even more familiar than the Batman suit across from him. It seemed that a black baldy had said something similar a few months ago. Luke didn't give him time to dwell on it. He simply raised his hand and snapped his fingers, before pointing south. "Let's go. You need to clear your head. Only then will you be convinced by our conversation after that." With that, flames burst out under Luke's feet as he shot into the sky and headed south. Tony didn't hesitate either as his Iron Man suit followed closely behind in a long streak of flames. Several minutes later, 2 streaks of light landed on Staten Island. Tony looked around. This was a wasteland by the sea. There wasn't even a road here, let alone a person. "What are we doing here?" he asked in confusion. Luke crooked a finger and said, "Come, let's have a head-on battle. Let me see if your armor has improved." Tony was tempted. When he had been rescuing people from the LA earthquake last time, his Mark II's control had fallen far short, and he couldn't even enter a building to save people. After sensing this flaw, he made targeted improvements. Now that he had a sparring partner like Batman to test this suit on, it couldn't be any better. Then, "Here I come." With that, Tony adopted Bruce Lee's classic pose and bounced on his feet with his fists raised. Luke's eyes lit up. "Huh. Not bad. That was pretty good. Metal armor wasn't soft clothes. These movements weren't hard to do, the difficult part was that they had to be gentle and natural. Tony's Mark IV suit was basically able to do it, which proved that his control had improved significantly. Secondly, Tony's movements really were a little like Bruce Lee's. He had definitely gotten more combat training. Luke was secretly amused. While this tycoon hadn't said anything, his actions were very honest. It seemed that he hadn't been idle in the last few months. With a loud bang, a jet of flames shot out of Tony's left foot as his right foot kicked out in front of Luke. Luke wasn't surprised at this sort of shameless behavior, which relied on the power of the jet propulsion system. He simply leaned back and grabbed Tony's right foot with both hands, before kicking the tycoon's left foot. Duong. A second later, Tony's lips twitched. He turned his head and looked at Luke, who had jumped to the side. He wanted to curse. What the hell kind of fighting technique is that? Luke chuckled. I'm just playing around. Why would I need some fighting technique? Tony strongly resisted the urge to cover his groin with both hands. He activated the propulsion system and forced his legs to fold back together. At that moment, he was extremely glad that he had done a lot of combat training in the past few months. He could just barely do a split, otherwise, with that last maneuver, he would have been rolling over the ground with his hands over his groin. Given how strong the suit was, he would have sunk right into the ground. While maintaining world peace recently, this wasn't an issue he had needed to consider. But Luke had grabbed his right leg earlier with both hands and then kicked his left leg, and Tony had smashed onto the ground with his legs spread. It was a good thing that the Iron Man suit protected his vitals between his legs, otherwise, it would have been a tragic story for the young master. After this split, Tony finally wasn't so cocky. Doing a flying kick at a combat master like Batman was a joke. From the attack just now, Tony confirmed that Batman's new suit was very strong, and not much weaker than Mark IV. Otherwise, it wouldn't be strong enough to hold the legs of the Iron Man suit in place and force Tony to do a split on the ground. When the pulling sensation in his groin eased a little, Tony attacked again. This time, he didn't do anything fancy with the jets anymore, and aimed a punch at Luke's head. Luke nodded approvingly at this approach. Was Tony a weak chicken? As far as Luke was concerned, that was indeed the case. But in terms of an ordinary person's physique, Tony's combat skills had already surpassed that of an amateur. The tycoon would be able to duke it out even in a real boxing ring. Even if he would probably only win 2 out of every 10 matches or less, he could still be considered close to the pro level. It was also because Tony was focused on the Iron Man suit. Also taking into consideration that he had been busy taking back his shares, and transforming and cleaning up the company, Tony had spent at most 1/10 of his time on combat training. In just a few months, he had leveled up from an amateur to a newbie pro fighter. Technically speaking, Tony's understanding of real combat had started with his kidnapping a few months ago. Furthermore, he would become a leading figure in the future. Apart from his wealth, his leadership and combat skills couldn't be poor, or he wouldn't be able to win over the public. Director Nick Fury was another example. Even though he was a leader with first-class strategic thinking, he couldn't lead the heroes into battle, and could only be the brain. Once the Avengers' big moment arrived, nobody would think of the director at all. But the more Tony improved, the less dignity Luke would afford him. Today, he was going to ruthlessly kick this young master around. If he didn't fire up this tycoon's proud but delicate heart now, Tony would become complacent when he thought that no one could beat him. How could Luke let a genius like this squander his youth? This guy was almost 40 years old, and needed to be pushed hard before he got too old. Thus, when Tony lunged, Luke didn't hesitate to grab Tony's fist and twist. Bang! Bang! Tony felt like he was being flipped, and then, he was flipped over and over again. Jarvis reminded him in concern, the armor is 0.5% damaged. There's no danger for now, but you may throw up, sir. Tony was indeed a little dizzy. In 3 seconds, Luke had him thrown onto the ground 7 to 8 times, it was far more stimulating than a roller coaster. Before Tony could think of a counterattack, Luke let go of his arm again and retreated 5 meters. Tony, who was lying in the mud, suddenly got up. He swayed for a moment, and was a little dizzy. He subconsciously asked, "Why aren't we fighting? I haven't lost yet." Luke chuckled. "This is just a lesson. Hitting you isn't the goal, it's more important to show you your shortcomings." Tony was doubtful. He felt that things weren't that simple. But now was not the time to think about it. After a few slow seconds, he charged forward again. This time, when his fist was 3 meters away from Luke, it suddenly opened and fired. As if he had predicted it, Luke bent low, and as he spun away to avoid the palm cannon, he roared inwardly, "Shoryuken." The next moment, he did an uppercut as he punched Tony in the ribs and sent the metal suit flying. Bang! Tony flew up again. Luke activated the jets on his feet and followed the metal armor, punching and kicking like a storm. Tony was once again able to enjoy the feeling of the world spinning around him. While the series of attacks didn't damage the metal armor, he spun in the sky as he fell. In the end, he could only activate his jets and try to put some distance between them. But Luke saw it coming. The moment Tony activated the jets, Luke clenched his fists, raised them high, and then smashed down on the back of the metal armor. Duong! The tycoon hit the mud upside down so that his legs were sticking out. The jets on his legs spluttered, but the metal suit could only move a dozen centimeters in the mud. 10 seconds later, Tony Stark pulled himself out of the mud, gasping for breath. Looking at Luke, who had retreated again, he was aggrieved. He flipped open his mask and asked, "What do you want to prove? To show off that you're better at close combat?" A few meters away, Luke crossed his arms. His cape unfurled and flapped in the night wind. He clearly had no intention of taking action. Watching the guy slowly stand up, he said, "No, I'm just telling you that you're not invincible. If you plan to just fly around in the sky in the future and blow up all your opponents with plasma cannons and mini-missiles, that's fine, but you can't save the world with just that. You can kill bad guys with the plasma cannons and the mini-missiles, but you can't use them with civilians around." Tony asked, "So? Do I need to hire you as a combat coach?" Luke chuckled. "No need. In any case, you'll never be as good as me." Tony, F***CKU. Although he couldn't see the tycoon's face, Luke could picture it. He was secretly amused as he continued, "You're smarter than I am. You said yourself that the armor is you, so do your best to make it better. Don't get complacent after this small success. You can still do a lot." Tony stared at Batman blankly, and a thought suddenly popped into his head. "Who the hell are you? Even my father never. Wait, only my father has ever said that to me." Luke talked big, but he actually didn't take it seriously. He wasn't counting on his words to move Tony. Thus, this small competition was only to make it clear that Batman was a man of pure integrity. It absolutely wasn't about showing off. Whether the tycoon believed it or not, in any case, Luke himself believed it. Actions and results always worked the best with this young master. Luke had deliberately lured the tycoon into a head-on clash, and had seized the opportunity to beat him up. Then, he acted all high and mighty. These sorts of actions and outcomes were enough to stab the tycoon in the heart. To use a line from an online novel to describe what the tycoon was thinking at that moment, it was probably, "Nobody can act pretentious in front of me, not even God." This arrogant tycoon wouldn't give up until he got his revenge. Tony's face was dark and his mind was in a mess. On one hand, he felt that Batman wouldn't be so petty as to deliberately attack him. The whole world knew that Batman didn't have that much time on his hands. On the other hand, he was indeed unhappy. In the battle just now, his suit didn't even sustain 1% damage, but the Batman suit was at most just a little dirty, it didn't even have a dent. This proved that Batman was far more skilled in close combat than he was. But Tony didn't want to dwell on it. That was because he didn't like to lose. After a brief silence, Tony said, "What do you mean I'm not the only superhero?" He didn't think that Batman was implying that he was the first superhero. Luke said, "What I really want to say is that you might have to face even more supervillains." Saying that, he threw a USB at Tony. Was Tony a weak chicken? As far as Luke was concerned, that was indeed the case. But in terms of an ordinary person's physique, Tony's combat skills had already surpassed that of an amateur. The tycoon would be able to duke it out even in a real boxing ring. Even if he would probably only win 2 out of every 10 matches or less, he could still be considered close to the pro level. It was also because Tony was focused on the Iron Man suit. Also taking into consideration that he had been busy taking back his shares, and transforming and cleaning up the company, Tony had spent at most 1/10 of his time on combat training. In just a few months, he had leveled up from an amateur to a newbie pro fighter. Technically speaking, Tony's understanding of real combat had started with his kidnapping a few months ago. Furthermore, he would become a leading figure in the future. Apart from his wealth, his leadership and combat skills couldn't be poor, or he wouldn't be able to win over the public. Director Nick Fury was another example. Even though he was a leader with first-class strategic thinking, he couldn't lead the heroes into battle, and could only be the brain. Once the Avengers' big moment arrived, nobody would think of the director at all. But the more Tony improved, the less dignity Luke would afford him. Today, he was going to ruthlessly kick this young master around. If he didn't fire up this tycoon's proud but delicate heart now, Tony would become complacent when he thought that no one could beat him. How could Luke let a genius like this squander his youth? This guy was almost 40 years old, and needed to be pushed hard before he got too old. Thus, when Tony lunged, Luke didn't hesitate to grab Tony's fist and twist. Bang! Bang! Tony felt like he was being flipped, and then, he was flipped over and over again. Jarvis reminded him in concern, "The armor is 0.5% damaged. There's no danger for now, but you may throw up, sir." Tony was indeed a little dizzy. In 3 seconds, Luke had him thrown onto the ground 7 to 8 times. It was far more stimulating than a roller coaster. Before Tony could think of a counterattack, Luke let go of his arm again and retreated 5 meters. Tony, who was lying in the mud, suddenly got up. He swayed for a moment, and was a little dizzy. He subconsciously asked, "Why aren't we fighting? I haven't lost yet." Luke chuckled. "This is just a lesson. Hitting you isn't the goal, it's more important to show you your shortcomings." Tony was doubtful. He felt that things weren't that simple. But now was not the time to think about it. After a few slow seconds, he charged forward again. This time, when his fist was 3 meters away from Luke, it suddenly opened and fired. As if he had predicted it, Luke bent low, and as he spun away to avoid the palm cannon, he roared inwardly, "Shoryuken." The next moment, he did an uppercut as he punched Tony in the ribs and sent the metal suit flying. Bang! Tony flew up again. Luke activated the jets on his feet and followed the metal armor, punching and kicking like a storm. Tony was once again able to enjoy the feeling of the world spinning around him. While the series of attacks didn't damage the metal armor, he spun in the sky as he fell. In the end, he could only activate his jets and try to put some distance between them. But Luke saw it coming. The moment Tony activated the jets, Luke clenched his fists, raised them high, and then smashed down on the back of the metal armor. Duong! The tycoon hit the mud upside down so that his legs were sticking out. The jets on his legs spluttered, but the metal suit could only move a dozen centimeters in the mud. 10 seconds later, Tony Stark pulled himself out of the mud, gasping for breath. Looking at Luke, who had retreated again, he was aggrieved. He flipped open his mask and asked, "What do you want to prove? To show off that you're better at close combat?" A few meters away, Luke crossed his arms. His cape unfurled and flapped in the night wind. He clearly had no intention of taking action. Watching the guy slowly stand up, he said, "No, I'm just telling you that you're not invincible. If you plan to just fly around in the sky in the future and blow up all your opponents with plasma cannons and mini-missiles, that's fine, but you can't save the world with just that. You can kill bad guys with the plasma cannons and the mini-missiles, but you can't use them with civilians around." Tony asked, "So? Do I need to hire you as a combat coach?" Luke chuckled. "No need. In any case, you'll never be as good as me." Tony, F***CKU. Although he couldn't see the tycoon's face, Luke could picture it. He was secretly amused as he continued, "You're smarter than I am. You said yourself that the armor is you, so do your best to make it better. Don't get complacent after this small success. You can still do a lot." Tony stared at Batman blankly, and a thought suddenly popped into his head. "Who the hell are you? Even my father never. Wait, only my father has ever said that to me." Luke talked big, but he actually didn't take it seriously. He wasn't counting on his words to move Tony. Thus, this small competition was only to make it clear that Batman was a man of pure integrity. It absolutely wasn't about showing off. Whether the tycoon believed it or not, in any case, Luke himself believed it. Actions and results always worked the best with this young master. Luke had deliberately lured the tycoon into a head-on clash, and had seized the opportunity to beat him up. Then, he acted all high and mighty. These sorts of actions and outcomes were enough to stab the tycoon in the heart. To use a line from an online novel to describe what the tycoon was thinking at that moment, it was probably, "Nobody can act pretentious in front of me, not even God." This arrogant tycoon wouldn't give up until he got his revenge. Tony's face was dark and his mind was in a mess. On one hand, he felt that Batman wouldn't be so petty as to deliberately attack him. The whole world knew that Batman didn't have that much time on his hands. On the other hand, he was indeed unhappy. In the battle just now, his suit didn't even sustain 1% damage, but the Batman suit was at most just a little dirty. It didn't even have a dent. This proved that Batman was far more skilled in close combat than he was. But Tony didn't want to dwell on it. That was because he didn't like to lose. After a brief silence, Tony said, "What do you mean I'm not the only superhero?" He didn't think that Batman was implying that he was the first superhero. Luke said, "What I really want to say is that you might have to face even more supervillains." Saying that, he threw a USB at Tony. Tony caught the USB. "What's this?" Luke said, "From the information I gathered, some people are experimenting on superhumans." Tony's heart jumped. Tony had known that this was inevitable, but he had subconsciously ignored it. Most of the organizations involved in these sorts of experiments were established and were mostly involved in government research. It was like there were mercenaries active in the Middle East and South America who did America's dirty work. If anything happened, it was the private company that took the fall, while nothing was said at all about the benefits that America reaped. Stark Industries had been in the weapons business for decades. It could already be considered good of them that they had never dabbled in projects like these. Luke couldn't be bothered to guess what the tycoon was thinking. He simply continued, "I think they'll cause trouble sooner or later. It's Murphy's Law, one day, they'll create a supervillain who will be a danger to society. Be careful. These test subjects might not care about your CEO identity." Tony was stunned. "Don't you want my help to deal with those people?" Of course, Luke knew that the tycoon was referring to the people behind the experiments. He chuckled. "Do you know why I've never shown my face?" Tony immediately understood. "So that you don't have anything to worry about." Luke nodded. "You have Stark Industries behind you, but that also means you have to yield to certain rules. If you break those rules, Stark Industries will no longer be your shield." Tony was silent. He was well aware of that, which was why he wouldn't hesitate to kill 100 terrorists if he had to. Settling accounts with Obadiah and reducing the company's weapons department had all been handled internally. Lashing out in a Congress hearing had been normal for a businessman who was protecting his own interests. But Iron Man wouldn't dare directly blow up those weapons companies. Tony's willful and unrestrained behavior stopped at him alone. That was the rule. If he broke this rule, those under Stark Industries' protection and his allies would become the ones to suppress him. Stark Industries was both the strongest protection and strongest restraints, and Tony couldn't escape it. To the American market and the government, he had to be a firm rulemaker and protector. Violating or destroying the rules meant destroying Stark Industries, which meant destroying himself. Luke didn't hit him again this time. He simply said, ordinary people have their own responsibilities, and so do superheroes. You can hunt down terrorists all over the world, but I can kill some crazy B****stards. There's no difference when it comes to saving innocent lives. Tony was a little embarrassed. Batman was very self-aware and didn't care about status, but Tony did. But now that it was laid out for him, the tycoon realized that he was acting a little like a villain. Luke changed the topic. Why do you still have the injury on your chest? Tony hesitated for a moment before he told the truth. I checked with a top specialist. It would be a very risky procedure. Luke had a strange expression on his face. Are you serious? Tony smiled bitterly. The shrapnel is close to my heart. If anything goes wrong, my heart will. He made an exploding gesture. Although it was exaggerated, it very clearly meant death. Thinking for a moment, Luke nodded. I'll make something for you. I'll give it to you tomorrow night. It might be useful for your ailment. Tony was stunned. You know how to do that? Luke said, normal external injuries are fine, but as for your condition, I'm not so sure. If you start acting crazy later, you can come look for me. Tony, do I look like I'm nuts to you? You're the one who likes to wear black and pretend to be a bat. Too lazy to look at his expression, Luke continued, keep the thing, I'll be giving you a secret. The fewer people who know about it, the better. Tony asked, what is it? Luke said, a drug, a friend stole it from someone who has a lot of influence in the underworld. Tony opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. To be able to make Batman deem it influential, it definitely had to be a troublesome underworld force. While Tony wasn't afraid of the underground forces, he wouldn't provoke them. More importantly, this was stolen. Batman's friend probably wasn't a good person either. As for himself, he and Batman were just rival competitors, so he was a good person. It was that simple. That was what the tycoon told himself. With that, Luke raised his head and looked at the night sky. I'm leaving. Don't follow me. Tony snorted reflexively. Who wants to follow you? Without looking back, Luke activated his optical camouflage and melted into the night. He said, okay, you can lead the paparazzi away. You're good at that. Tony looked at Manhattan in the northeast as several helicopters approached. He couldn't help but curse. F***ck. They're really quick. His entire encounter with Batman had taken roughly 20 minutes, and the paparazzi had already come rushing over. But compared with Batman, who basically didn't interact with paparazzi, Tony was confident he could deal with these guys. After giving the order to Jarvis, his BGM rang out, and the suit soared into the sky and flew back to Manhattan. As long as you can't catch up to me, it's not a problem. A certain tycoon was just this blunt. Putting aside Tony, who had left the helicopters so far behind they couldn't even eat his dust, Luke quietly went home, took off his armor, and entered the lab. Naturally, that fight earlier had been deliberate. Tony had also tacitly agreed to Luke's victory, so the list of the tycoon's abilities in the system lit up again. Luke, who was too absorbed in his research, only sensed after a moment that the tycoon's abilities had swiftly improved recently. It wasn't like before he was kidnapped, when he was lazy and had no purpose. Now, the tycoon's energy was focused on two things, the suit and energy. The reason he was treating energy as a separate entity was because Stark Industries was preparing to undertake new energy projects. Compared with the reactor that was the size of a kid's fist in the metal suit, the large arc reactor which Tony had just designed had a lot of power. A dozen of them would be able to power 1/3 of New York. This reactor was a large-scale counterpart of the reactor in the metal suit. In reality, it took up little albeit highly controlled space, and had a low risk factor, which was why they could be stored in the basement in Stark Tower. Pepper had already spread the word among the company's board of directors. After some verification, Luke confirmed that Stark Industries' stock price was going to skyrocket again. In any case, Jenny's team had already entered the battlefield, and was just waiting to make a killing again. Secondly, whether it was Tony's main suit, Mark IV, or the portable Mark V, they were very attractive to Luke. With Mark V, in particular, Luke could compare it with his own portable armor and make an even more advanced product. Luke wasn't Tony. His physique was very strong, so the armor's protection wasn't as important. However, being able to put it on quickly was very practical. Another piece of good news was that Tony had made a bit of progress in the nanotechnology research on his armor. Although it wasn't a major development, Luke could still try to use this new technology to make an extremely simple version of the Thousand Faces armor. If he could make something where a person's external appearance didn't change, but they had part of the armor's abilities, his family would benefit from it. This was far easier than Sentinel Services trying to seize superpowers and strengthen the human body. As long as his technical skills met the requirements, the rest was just a matter of money. Money wasn't a big problem for him now. At the same time, the American news media exploded once again. Iron Man, who had just gone through a hearing at Congress, was caught by the paparazzi on camera in a private night meeting with Batman. This was explosive news. After the California earthquake, Batman seemed to have disappeared, and there were no signs of this #1 superhero in Los Angeles. In the last few months, Batman had switched from being the main character in media reports to being Iron Man's sidekick. Most of the time, he was mentioned in relation to Iron Man. In the end, this superhero suddenly appeared again, and he had gone to Stark Tower, proving that whatever happened before wasn't unfounded. But that wasn't what certain big shots cared about. What they cared about was that in the video taken by the paparazzi, Batman was also wearing a brand new Batman suit that looked 50 to 60% like the Iron Man suit. After they met, they flew out of Manhattan one after another. As the paparazzi tailed them, everybody now knew that the two had probably gotten into a fight on the beach on Staten Island. Even though Tony Stark showed up at a business gathering the next day like nothing was out of the ordinary, the news media used their pro skills at bullsh*ting and misrepresentation to create all sorts of drama. Batman steals Iron Man's armor technology, a huge falling out and a fight, and shock. After not meeting for half a year, surprising cracks in Iron Man and Batman's relationship, and Bat/Iron CP in danger, and here's why, numerous headlines bred like flies. Of course, that last headline on some internet website was followed by a huge bunch of eager women. This news was a party for the general public. Many of the higher-ups started to get restless again. For example, the members of Congress who had just been slapped in the face were probably thinking something along the lines of, "He can touch it, but we can't." Tony would rather give the armor technology to an unknown like Batman than to America. This was different from what Tony had said in Congress yesterday. For a moment, the private phone lines of many big shots rang non-stop, and each conversation often took more than 10 minutes. Their private meetings also increased significantly, and another round of schemes against the Iron Man suit began. Tony Stark didn't care about that at all. He returned to the tower and got to work. Although Batman had taught him another lesson, Tony's unwillingness to admit defeat didn't discourage him. Instead, he was inspired again, and came up with a lot of ideas for improving his armor. In a sense, Tony and Luke felt pretty much the same way whenever they met. They couldn't sleep if they didn't test their new ideas right away after that. On this point, who knew if it was Tony who had led Luke astray, or vice versa? After tinkering around in the workshop in high spirits, Luke went to Stark Tower the following night with the first batch of the blood orchid drug he had just created. This time, he directly hacked into Stark Tower's security system to let Jarvis know when he was coming. Jarvis immediately notified Tony, who had just woken up and was working. At Tony's instruction, Jarvis opened the elevator doors in the underground parking lot for Luke, who was invisible. Looking at the Batman suit after Luke cancelled the stealth mode, Tony's tech side couldn't help but act up. He projected the image from Jarvis's surveillance feed and said, "There are a lot of issues with your stealth technology. The heat emissions are a problem, and the light distortions it creates can't fool Jarvis. It's only good enough to get by electronic surveillance." Luke was too lazy to listen to him. The list of the Tycoon's abilities had only just been refreshed in the system. Luke could do the modifications himself after this. "Alright, my armor only has some minor shortcomings, but there's a huge hole in your chest. Who do you think has the bigger problem?" Tony choked. He could comfort himself with the words, "Although I have a hole in my chest, my armor is strong." But in front of Batman, it could only be said that everybody had their own strength. He would rather believe that it was because the other party had a stronger physique. This could be seen from the fact that the first-generation Batman suit didn't have any supporting propulsion system. Batman had relied completely on his physical strength to move like normal. After interrupting the Tycoon's rambling, Luke didn't waste any time. He simply opened the small silver cooler he was holding. 12 glass test tubes lay in recesses, each of which contained 100 millimeters of light red liquid. Tony stepped forward. "What's this?" "I call it Life One." Luke casually came up with a product name. More specifically, it should allow external injuries to recover very well, and most fractures and cuts will heal in 3 to 5 days. Tony was surprised. "Are you serious? If an ordinary person was accidentally cut by a kitchen knife, it would take about 5 days to make a full recovery. The cuts Luke was referring to had to be from a battle. It would already be pretty good to recover from something like that in a month or two. Bone fractures took even longer to heal, around 2 to 3 months. Luke nodded. "But this was stolen. I don't have any information on the components. You should do an analysis and test it first." Saying that, he took out a USB. "This is some information on a similar drug used by that underworld force. It's for you. Any more questions?" Tony frowned. "What do you want?" He was a businessman, and his first reaction when he ran into a situation was always, "What's the catch?" Why would Batman give Life One away for nothing if it had such miraculous effects? If it were anyone else, Tony would immediately suspect that there was something wrong with the drug. But in front of Batman, he would rather first consider what the other party wanted in exchange. Luke chuckled. "It's simple, as long as you figure out the functions and side effects of Life One and share the research with me, I can continue doing more tests for you." Tony's heart jumped. "It's that simple." Luke said, "Of course. If there are no unacceptable side effects, it's a life-saving drug that can save lives in an emergency. I need something like that." Tony felt that he was being looked down on again. He was thinking about a business transaction, while Batman was thinking about saving lives. Damn it. Aren't you Batman? Why are you stealing an angel's job? The Tycoon glared at the charcoal head in front of him and cursed inwardly. A moment later, he closed the box. Deal. Luke nodded in satisfaction. "Jarvis, help me open the elevator doors. I'm leaving." Watching him walk to the elevator, Tony couldn't help but ask, "Hey, how do I give you the research results?" Luke threw him a USB without looking back. "There's a way to contact me inside." Tony caught it. Luke said, "You can leave a message if you need help. Of course, preferably at night." Tony's lips twitched. "You're not really a bat, are you?" The image of a big bat spirit bustling around in a dark cave during the day popped into his head, and he felt it was quite funny. Luke turned his head, and his blood-red lenses seemed to flash with disdain. No, Batman is only a part-time job, it's just like how your main role is the CEO of Stark Industries. Tony was lost for words. He had been CEO for more than 10 years, and it had only been a few months since he started his part-time job as Iron Man. Batman had a point, and Tony couldn't argue with that. Tony pondered as Luke took the elevator down. The Batman suit 2.0 wasn't anything ordinary. It was slightly below Mark IV's level, but only 30% at most. Also, as a top genius in weapons development, Tony knew that the way the Batman suit and the Iron Man suit were designed weren't the same. As support-type armor for use in the city, the power system for the Batman suit 2.0 wasn't any worse than Mark IV's, and there were practically no weapon systems installed. But it was also far more stealthy and agile than Mark IV. Even if Tony had said that there was something wrong with the Batman suit's stealth system, he had just been nitpicking. There were always flaws in any real product. The perfect product only existed in dreams, a designer could only make choices based on practical needs. The Batman suit's current performance was enough to meet Batman's requirements, so it was a mid-level product. That was right, it could only be considered above average at most, and no more. The best armor will always be my Mark armor. The Tycoon made up his mind, but when he turned around and saw the cooler which contained Life 1, his expression couldn't help falling. Fine, his puny life was also very important. If he wasn't alive to do the research, the metal suit would quickly become outdated. A little depressed, Tony walked over and picked up the cooler. Jarvis, get my private plane ready. I'm going back to the Malibu villa. He usually liked to go back and forth between New York and Los Angeles in his metal suit, which was much faster than a private plane. However, with Life 1 on him, it was impossible for Luke to fly at supersonic speed with such an important thing. He could only take the plane back. Thankfully, he could still work on the plane, so it wouldn't be a waste of time. Thinking that, Tony put on his armor and flew straight to his private airfield. Luke was feeling very cheerful. He was too terrible at research, even in the pharmaceutical line which Tony didn't pay as much attention to. Even ignoring the flashes of inspiration Tony got as a protagonist, Luke couldn't compare with Stark Industries, which could set up a complete pharmaceutical research team at any time. It wasn't just about the money, but about the overwhelming advantage of fame and power. Thankfully, Luke didn't care about honor so much. This time, he had refreshed the Tycoon's abilities in his system. He had to give the Tycoon something in return, helping him treat his stupidity would be enough to calm him down. He could use Tony's strength to complete his research on Life 1, and Luke had the most important raw ingredient, the blood orchid extract. There was no need to worry that he would be kicked out of the game. It wasn't because Luke was wary of Tony, but because Life 1 might really be something extraordinary. In his preliminary study, this drug that was created from the blood orchid extract had some amazing power. Treating external injuries was just its simplest and most obvious function. Sloan had said that it could also treat the damage to the body and brain caused by physical outburst and curve shooting. This was damage at a genetic level. Sloan had basically been making car tires out of gold and flaunting them on the streets. If Tony Stark knew about this, he would definitely curse Sloan for squandering such a treasure. However, it would already be pretty good if there were any results from his research on Life 1 in a few months. There was no need to worry about that for now. Luke quickly tamped down his excitement and returned home to his own work. The most important thing for now was still to clear the small instance that was Sentinel Services. A set or even a few suitable sets of armor would double the gains from this instance. He had to be prepared as much as possible. A few more peaceful days passed. Luke moved Carol and Lorna to another apartment building, where they continued to remain in hiding. Their faces were fine now, but the Thousand Faces system couldn't change their figures. The eye-catching difference in height between the two girls would easily draw attention. Stacy and the other two girls had already moved into the employee dorms that the record company had rented. With the other employees as cover and no threat from Sentinel services, they were very safe. On the other side, the high table was still silent, and no one made a move against the boogeyman. According to Gianna, the high table was currently engaging in a power struggle, which was caused by the recent movements of Boogeyman John. Following her resurrection as planned, she finally completed the coronation ceremony and officially became the head of the family. Santino was dead, but the bounty he put up was still in effect. Although it was very bizarre that the bounty put up by the dead Santino was to avenge his very much alive sister, Gianna, the 10 million and the special contribution reward would draw another wave of hitmen. However, the heads of those who wanted to make a fortune cooled a little after what happened to Tarasov, Santino, and the fraternity. Few killers would dare take this bounty. The chance to kill more than 100 hitmen in one go definitely wouldn't appear again. More importantly, it was Boogeyman John who had violated the rule of the blood oath. Not only didn't he kill Gianna, he had even killed Santino, his client. However, as one of the 12 members of the high table, Gianna refused to announce excommunication or a bounty, because she suggested that Santino's bounty was against the rules. It made no sense that Santino could use the high table's reward to put out a bounty on one of the 12 members, while the high table insisted that John fulfill the blood oath. If the 12 members accepted this behavior, then everybody could issue commissions in the future and assassinate one another, and the high table would have to continue giving out rewards. The high table was divided on this matter. Although she had yet to become one of the 12 when Santino gave John the commission, Gianna was one of them now. If the blood oath which the high table created could be used to force a killer to assassinate any of the 12 members, and they had to succeed no matter what, then what use were the 12 members' authority and intelligence? So, it wasn't hard to understand Gianna's attitude now. Not only had Boogeyman John let her go, he had also helped her get rid of Santino and obtain the position of head of the family. Naturally, she was unwilling to acknowledge that bounty. As soon as the fraternity sent out elite assassins to meddle in the battle for the position of head of the family, Boogeyman John had immediately gone to kill Sloane's 19 legendary assassins. In this situation, even an idiot would be able to tell that the Boogeyman and Gianna were in cahoots. At the same time, only an idiot would tell the high table to deal with Boogeyman John. Gianna had just become one of the 12, and her position wasn't stable yet. But as long as she had the Boogeyman as an ally, she had a lethal trump card. If anyone voiced agreement to excommunication and the bounty this time, it was very likely that Gianna would happily pass on the man's name to the Boogeyman. Even the 12 high and mighty members didn't want to provoke the current night demon. This guy had retired 4 years ago for some reason, but when he became active again, he was unexpectedly terrifying. In comparison, the fraternity and Tarasov had had too many deaths recently, leaving behind a lot of territory, and everyone could take a share. This involved low risks and yielded more gains. It was much more cost-effective than dealing with that D***MN, tough lone wolf. Thanks to Gianna's efforts, the 12 members of the high table could only put aside punishing Boogeyman John for now. When Luke learned of this outcome, he could only lament. But he couldn't yell at Gianna, "Why are you so proactive?" He could only hold back. It was also good to put the high table aside for the time being. It was impossible for such a big underground force to disappear. After he was done with Sentinel services, he would come back and slowly shear the sheep at the high table. When the time came, his experience and credit points wouldn't be able to escape. After Luke was engrossed in his work for a few days, Selena suddenly raised something at dinner. "Hey, are you really not going to check out the digging that the real estate company is doing next door?" Luke was stunned. "Digging? Wait, are they still digging?" Selena stared at him speechlessly for a moment, before she shook her head and sighed. "Although our place is soundproof, the other residents can't take it anymore. Every now and then, they hear the drone of machines, as if a mine is being opened. When I went to work in the morning, Karen even stopped me and told me to tell you about it. Luke scratched his head in embarrassment. He had really forgotten about it. A few days after Foggy said that the mysterious real estate company had moved in and was secretly working on the project, Luke sent out a mini drone to take a look, and found that they were digging a hole. Whatever the real estate company's goal was, it absolutely wasn't the refurbishment of the sewerage system that they were talking about. Because the value of the building absolutely didn't require sewers that were 10 meters in diameter. It wasn't important why they were digging. What was important was that after he told Foggy, people from New York's HQ and the municipal department had come, but nothing had happened. Clearly, they had influence which easily stopped the authorities. It wasn't easy to make these departments knowingly break the law, but it was very easy for them to make the process less efficient and delay construction for a few months. Luke didn't have any proof either. Saying that they were digging a hole and manufacturing illegal drugs seemed too outrageous, so he had shelved the matter for the time being. After hearing what Selina said, he finally remembered. Rubbing his chin, he looked at Selina and said, "Why don't we take a look tonight?" Selina said, "Okay." Luke rarely took her to look at the night lights anymore, and it was a little boring beating up hoodlums on her own. She felt that the main reason was that she wasn't as flashy as Luke. She simply broke bones and sent the hospital a string of new patients, and called it a day. When she went with Luke, he could always find new fun in these small operations. With just a few sentences and a few movements, some of these hooligans would be so frightened that they lost control of their bowels. It was full of black humor. At first, she had rejected this sort of sick interest. But when she saw how Luke made these hoodlums **t their pants and make a beeline for the patrol cars to turn themselves in, the illegal drugs in their hands, she fell in love with this feeling. As for the smell, it didn't exist. The new suit completely blocked out scents, and the mess was basically in the hooligans' pants. At most, she could only see water stains. Only the hooligans, who had complicated and painful expressions, knew what it felt like to run with **t in their pants. Luke and Selina agreed that they weren't in a hurry, and they finished their daily training and work first. At 9 o'clock, 2 people and 1 dog put on their stealth suits and left the house. It was too close to their house in Clinton, and Luke and Selina had to go through the underground passage before doubling back. The residents of the apartment building had basically moved out. Most of the units were dark, and it looked like a haunted building, which made it easier for Luke, Selina and the dog to sneak in. Reaching the hole, Luke looked down and was a little surprised. He said over the internal comm, "This is, at least 20 meters deep, right?" Selina said, "I was here a few days ago, but they hadn't gone that deep yet. There hadn't been any plastic tarpaulin at the bottom either." Luke said, "Let's go down and take a look." It wasn't just one piece of tarpaulin, the plastic covered the entire pit and hid the bottom from view. Looking down, nothing could be seen except for the shadows cast by the light on the plastic. Some were motionless junk, and some were moving figures and machines. When they entered, not only did they hear the droning which nearby residents complained about, they also heard an even more unpleasant screeching sound, like metal scraping over stone. They entered and saw something that looked like a small-scale tunnel boring machine at work. Luke was stunned. How did they bring this in? Selina was also astonished. Even if it was a small-scale tunnel boring machine, it would still be hard to stealthily move it into the Clinton area under so many eyes. But the real estate company had done it. After moving past the tarpaulin, Luke and Selina hid in a corner and didn't move forward as they watched the machine drill a stone door. A moment later, Selina couldn't help but ask, "This door isn't too big. Why don't they just dig from the side?" Luke shook his head. "This door is just one side of it. Just think of it as a stone box." Selina nodded and asked a second question. "There's something wrong with this stone door. Why aren't there any marks on it after so long?" Luke said, "Something's definitely wrong. From what the residents said, the machines have been working for a few days, but this stone door is intact. It's not just sturdy, there's probably another reason. Luke indeed didn't know exactly what this stone door was made of. But just like how the destroyer's skin hadn't broken even after being hit by an armor-piercing bullet at close range, this wasn't something that could be understood with Earth's current science. While this unknown thing might contain benefits, it could also be a trap. It wasn't worth acting blindly. Also, it would be very hard to move it, so Luke didn't pursue it further. As they were talking, Luke heard some activity. He used his ability to probe the top of the pit for a moment, and a strange expression appeared on his face. Daredevil and his ex-girlfriend are here. Don't move later, it'll be easy for this guy to detect us with his hearing. Selena stood still obediently, but she couldn't help but ask, ex-girlfriend? Isn't he afraid Karen will run off? Pondering for a moment, Luke said, what if he's treating them both the same? Selena asked, are you talking about yourself? Luke said, I'm still a kid, I'm not even 20 yet. I don't have as much experience as a 30-year-old man. Selena, hee. After talking over the internal comm for a bit, Matt and his ex appeared above the pit. But before they could come down, several red figures ran out of the darkness and surrounded them. Luke narrowed his eyes. Ninjas in red? The Hand? Matt and his ex had probably alerted the ninjas, who definitely hadn't been here just now, or Luke would have noticed them earlier. Selena asked, what are those ninjas doing? I haven't seen them recently, so I thought they gave up on the Clinton area. Luke said, let's take a look first. The duo above clearly didn't have much to talk about with the Hand. Without saying a word, they advanced and immediately started fighting. However, they were outnumbered. In just a few minutes, the duo fell to a disadvantage, and Matt decisively dragged his ex-girlfriend away. It was obvious that this guy had learned his lesson. He knew that he couldn't force his way through in certain situations, or a concussion, a tranquilizer dart or something similar awaited him. Looking at the image sent by the drone above the pit, Selena suddenly said bewilderedly, don't you think the leader of these ninjas looks familiar? Luke's eyes flashed. Yes. I stabbed him in the head with a knife last time, and I saw him die in front of us. Thoughts flashed through Selena's mind, and she was shocked. That group of ninjas next to the river. But didn't you kill them with knives? Luke sneered. I'm very interested in that too. Resurrecting the dead isn't a common thing. Let's go. Selena asked, aren't we going to deal with them? Luke said, just monitor the situation first. The Hand won't have just these few ninjas. Keep them alive and see if we can track them to their nest. These were all experience and credit points that had been sent to his door. It would be a waste if he didn't take them. He wouldn't kill these ninjas so easily, who knew, they might come back to life again after a few days. Coming back to life once after he killed them was already a miracle. If they did it again a second time, it would be a slap to his face. He wouldn't be able to take this grievance. Sneaking out, Luke installed surveillance cameras in various inconspicuous spots around the building to monitor it. Early the next morning, Luke went to Foggy's office and had him try persuading the residents who hadn't moved away to accept the conditions and move out of the apartment building. After thinking for a moment, Foggy's expression turned ugly. Is it dangerous? Luke didn't give him a straight answer. He simply said, I noticed strange movements with the people going in and out of the building. They're not small-time hoodlums. Any resident still there might get pulled in if anything happens. Foggy didn't doubt Luke. Luke had already proven his character through his donations and actions. More importantly, he found Luke pleasing to the eye, so he nodded and agreed. Actually, the company offered decent conditions for relocation. The remaining families are used to the place, and public security has become a lot better, which is why they refuse to move. If I explain the situation, they'll probably listen. Luke nodded. The Clinton area was in central Manhattan. Its notorious reputation had been deliberately put about by Kingpin and the other gangs. With a few reconstruction and renovation projects, a lot of capital would rush in, and real estate prices would skyrocket. There were plenty of gangs that hid out in old apartment buildings to sell illegal drugs. Gangs who operated out of luxury apartment buildings were very rare. At the same time, the high property prices would lead to high taxes, and NYPD would have to pay attention to security. At that time, it would be very difficult for any gang to do illegal business in the Clinton area. Nobody was stupid. Everybody who owned real estate in the Clinton area aimed to make money one day. The rent for houses in Clinton wasn't high, but property prices had always been high. It was through Jenny's connections that Luke had been able to purchase his 5-story building. Otherwise, it was impossible to buy a place by relying on just money alone. Owners would just wait for prices to continue increasing. Most of the people who lived in that apartment building were renters, not owners. Considering the strategic location and the ability to cut down on commuting costs, many people were reluctant to leave. Now that they had to take their lives into consideration, however, they would ultimately choose to stay away. After that, Luke was about to leave. Foggy stopped him. Luke waited a few seconds, but before the fatty could say anything, he saw the hesitant look on the fatty's face, and wanted to laugh. "Foggy, I'm not a woman. What's with that awkward expression? Don't say that you're coming out of the closet. I don't discriminate, but it's impossible for me to join that side." Foggy couldn't help but raise his middle finger, and things returned to normal. "You know that we're almost done with the community reconstruction project?" Luke nodded. The reconstruction project had been launched a few days before Christmas last year. It was already the middle of February, and should be completed in 2 months. "What? You're short of money, and you're afraid that someone will cause trouble." He casually mentioned the biggest possibility. Foggy shook his head. "No, we're keeping an eye on that, and it's enough." The truth was that they were indeed a little short of funds. Foggy was already prepared to take out part of this month's $50,000, which the firm received as a regular contribution, to make up this deficit. Luke asked, "So what's the problem?" Foggy said, "Actually, I think it could be considered a good thing, but there's a little problem for now." Luke said, "Tell me." "I'm worth hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute. I don't have time to play word games with you." Foggy was stunned. "Shouldn't that be my line, as a lawyer? Though, I'm only worth several $100s an hour in theory." Inwardly roasting Luke's terrible opening remark, Foggy nevertheless explained the details. As it turned out, the problem was with the interim construction team, but it couldn't simply be deemed a bad thing. At Luke's suggestion, an interim construction team had been set up, with Foggy and the others supervising and inspecting it every now and then. Unexpectedly, in these 2 months, it started looking like an actual renovation company. Based on Luke's understanding from his previous life, this team was already showing signs of developing into becoming an official contractor. Foggy, Karen and the veteran renovation workers were responsible for different parts of the work. Foggy and Karen had good management skills, and the veteran workers were very experienced. Coupled with the donations from Luke, the interim team had a good environment to work in. Now, this ad hoc team had inexplicably taken the form of a fledgling renovation company, and was operating well. Some people were moved. At the tail end of the community reconstruction, the old workers and a dozen temp kids found Foggy and seriously consulted him on whether or not they could set up an official renovation company. A renovation company with more than 20 people could already take on professional work for ordinary homes. Foggy was stunned by the unexpected proposal. After carefully considering it for 2 days, he and Karen helped the old workers analyze the feasibility of such a plan. Their final conclusion was that it was possible. But any newly opened business would always have a problem, and that was making a loss in the early stages. Few businesses didn't lose money the moment they opened. The only difference was for how long and how much. For a company like theirs, the best opening development would be to get a huge order. With the profits from this large project, the new renovation company would be able to win the hearts of its employees, and the profits would last for a period of time. Then, they could use this buffer period to expand the business and grow. Luke immediately understood. But it's hard to open for business with a large order. It's very likely that it'll be very hard for the company at the beginning. After toughing it out for a month or two, people might give up and the company might collapse. Foggy said, I thought as much, but the competition here in New York is too intense. If they butt in rashly, they might. He mimicked a swan dive with one hand. Luke smiled. Actually, you're not worried about the old workers, but about the kids, right? Foggy nodded subconsciously. That's right. Those old workers can continue working as laborers without the company, that life isn't too bad and they won't suffer too much. However, it wasn't easy for these dozen or so kids to get the chance to participate in the community reconstruction, and they didn't quit in the last 2 months. If the first venture fails, I'm afraid they'll think that their efforts were all for nothing. Ultimately, they'll only be able to join gangs, sell weed, and wind up dead on the streets or in prison. Luke understood this worry. A setback wasn't a problem for someone in their 30s or 40s. However, the half-grown kids on the streets of Clinton were just starting out. These young teenagers who grew up in a harsh environment were sensitive. If they did all they could but still failed, it would be very easy for them to think, since working hard didn't get me anywhere, why bother? At that time, they would choose a road of no return, and might be doomed to suddenly die before they turned 30. Thinking for a moment, Luke looked at Foggy. How do you want me to help? Foggy chuckled. Well, you're well informed. If you can find homes in need of renovation, I can send them to offer their services right away. Stumped for a moment, Luke got a strange expression on his face. Are you saying that you want me to give you information on places with more severe damage, and you'll get them to go tout their services? Foggy nodded. Like couples quarreling, unexpected fires, burst pipes, natural disasters, these sorts of homes. It wouldn't affect you too much. Luke was amused. Foggy's idea wasn't bad. The organization with the most information in New York was NYPD. It wasn't easy for a small company with 20 people to operate. They would have to run around in circles doing small jobs every day. On the other hand, something like this couldn't be considered a secret. Residents wouldn't be able to hide any accidents that happened in their homes from the neighbors, while NYPD was the one who had all this information. Luke wasn't in a hurry to give an answer. He simply said, let me think about it. I'll give you a reply tomorrow. He was about to get up, when he remembered something. Right, who are the dozen or so kids who want to work for the company? Foggy looked at him strangely. Charlie, Rackle, Hudson, Moby, Dito. You're familiar with most of them. Pleased, Luke smiled and stood up. Well, I'm glad that they're willing to walk the right path. It seems that all my hard work wasn't in vain. Seeing Luke leave the office, Foggy couldn't help but remark in a low voice, wasn't your hard work just bribing their mothers with money to force these brats to go and carry bricks? He then shook his head in amusement. Forget it. At the very least, these kids have hope. There were close to 150 teenagers and young adults participating in the community reconstruction project, but only 16 of them wanted to continue with the renovation company, which was around 10%. Luke had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars all up, and had given these dozen or so kids a chance to choose a different future. He couldn't be fussy about this good deed. Of course, Luke could hear what the fatty said behind his back. Fortunately, he was pretty much upfront about it. He went downstairs with a smile and told Selina about it in the car. After listening to him, Selina thought for a moment, before she nodded. It doesn't seem hard, right? It isn't hard to screen information that isn't related to private affairs, and they don't need a lot of work. Luke nodded. When she said it wasn't hard, she was referring to the SMART program. Both Little Snail and Sponge could carry out the screening. As for news on the police radio, that was already under Little Snail's surveillance. It really isn't hard, Luke said casually. So, I'll use the shell company to invest some money and buy some of its shares. Selina, huh? Luke chuckled. Do you remember why I set up the community reconstruction project? To make those brats carry bricks until they throw up, Selina replied without thinking. She then understood. Holy sh*t. You want them to carry bricks for you forever? Luke nodded matter-of-factly. Of course. That's a stable, blue-collar job that many people in New York would want to do. Selina, as long as you're happy. It didn't cost much to start this company. After these 2 months, everybody was well aware of how good those old workers were. The repaired homes were proof. Along with adopting Foggy's suggestion that they went to the door to tout their services, the company absolutely wouldn't make a loss. The only problem was that it would be a little more difficult at the beginning for these 10 or so temp apprentices to solicit jobs. But was that a bad thing? As the saying went, if you wanted to do something big, you had to eat dirt first. After eating this dirt, the dozen or so kids from the Clinton area would become part of the old cadre of the renovation company. They still had a long road ahead of them. Little could compare with the actions of these half-grown kids who were determined to change their fate. It was hard for anyone who didn't live in the slums to imagine their hardships. This was especially true of the black community. Most of them lived in dire straits, trying to pull themselves out was hard. Even Matt and Foggy couldn't compare. They were white, after all. Luke's life before he turned 18 was ordinary at most, but it wasn't hard at all. Robert, Catherine and Drax had provided the 3 children with education and meticulous care. As for the dozen or so kids in the renovation team, if their fathers weren't dead, they were better off not having any, whether because their fathers were in prison or didn't care. They grew up with their mothers, which was characteristic for them. It was for that reason that both Selina and Foggy had been surprised by Luke's charity fund, but they had no objections. In good spirits, Luke and Selina went to Dustin's office in the police department. This wasn't a scheduled meeting, but Dustin had called them to come in. Being able to take it easy most days meant that they had to give support whenever it was required. When they entered the office, Dustin, who was focused on the files, didn't even raise his head. He simply pointed, and Selina immediately closed the door. After working together for so long, a small gesture was all that was required to get things done. However, Luke, who was in a good mood, was feeling a little cheeky today. He asked, "Boss, do you have a cousin called Justin Hammer?" Hearing that, Dustin stopped flipping through the files and tossed them onto the table. He raised his head. "He's my cousin. Did he piss you off?" "No problem. You can deal with him however you like." They remembered what Selina had said when they were watching the news before, and how Luke said that she was brainless, but now. Selina immediately glanced at Luke to see if his face hurt from being slapped. Luke didn't feel embarrassed at all. Instead, he gave Dustin a strange look. "Boss, you never said that you have relatives like that." Dustin chuckled but looked neither pleased nor angry or jealous. He simply said casually, "That's because it's a distant relationship, we share a grandfather 3 generations back." Dustin and Justin shared the same great-great-grandfather. Looking at their faces, Dustin said casually, "Since my father's time, my family has had nothing to do with them. I don't want to talk about it." Luke and Selina understood. If they hadn't asked, Dustin would never have brought it up, because he didn't care about that side of the family. But since Luke had asked, he wouldn't lie. It could only be said that Dustin and Luke were no longer purely just allies or friends, which was why Dustin was so candid. Dustin switched topics and got down to business. "Tony Stark is in New York. You know that, right?" He didn't need them to answer, before he said, "He's holding the second Stark Expo. The official opening ceremony is in 3 days, so we've received a familiar assignment. You understand, right?" Luke rolled his eyes. Patrol the venue? Dustin said, given your outstanding performance at the LA Expo last time, you're responsible for patrolling the venue again before the opening ceremony, and you're in charge of communication between the Detective Bureau and Stark Industries security. Is there a problem? Luke, no problem. As the saying went, train soldiers for 1,000 days in order to deploy them for one moment. Dustin had let them off for more than a month, it was their duty to get to work now. After all, it was Stark Industries. After all, a certain pair had connections to Stark. Actually, the three of them were aware of the situation. After Luke and Selena were classified as strategic weapons that couldn't be used so easily, their efficiency at cracking cases had dropped significantly. In LA, they had been in the top 3. Here, they weren't even in the top 5. In terms of pure numbers, they were among the best in the Detective Bureau in terms of handling cases, and just slightly worse than John McClane, who was at the very top. There were also 4 or 5 other teams on the same level. Because that was enough. Although the two of them had a good relationship with their colleagues in the police department, they were too young, after all, and were outsiders. They would only make the old detectives uncomfortable if they were too diligent. They didn't need to be promoted yet, and being too diligent would only reduce the chances of other people being promoted, which would affect the good office atmosphere. Luke and Selena also needed their own time to improve their strength, and were able to spend a third of the time other people took to get things done, so nobody could criticize them. Because of that, they were actually very free, taking on something as time-consuming as patrol also wouldn't affect the Detective Bureau too much. Luke and Selena quickly accepted the assignment and left. Driving out of HQ, Luke and Selena went to Flushing, Queens, where the Stark Expo would be held. Tony had actually announced the start of the Stark Expo when he dropped from the sky a few nights ago, but the area was still under construction. The Stark Expo was different from the previous one in Los Angeles. Tony's father held the first and only expo here in 1974. Now, Tony was holding a second one. Secondly, the products exhibited at the Stark Expo were from high-tech enterprises from all over the world. This was a world-class stage. This was a technological version of the World Martial Arts Conference in wuxia novels, where everyone relied on their skills to fight for attention. The expo would run for a year, and the exhibits would be adjusted accordingly. Not every company had enough products for the expo. After a year on display, new companies and new products would start showing up. The venue even had an area for independents. As long as they passed the checks by the expo's administrative department, individual inventors could also put their own unique gadgets on display on this world stage. On their way there, Luke and Selena decided that they would take a look at the independent inventors when they were free. Who knew, they might run into some interesting inventions. There was a lot of technology that was of no value to inventors because it was very hard to turn them into reality. Without anything tangible to show for it, they wouldn't have any money to continue researching, which made it even harder to produce anything. Luke felt that if he could fish out just 1 or 2 good items, this patrol assignment would be worth it. For the next 2 days, Luke and Selena constantly roamed the expo's venue, and even just ate lunch in their car. After lunch, Luke and Selena took advantage of whatever free time they had to look at the independent vendors and enjoy the bustle. After 2 days, Selena treated these booths like a show. A lot of people had come to Stark Expo from all over the world, including top experts, researchers, and technical specialists. These were people who basically wouldn't usually appear in this area, but there were plenty of related low to mid-tier personnel who had pretty much the same idea as Luke and Selena as they strolled around to see if they could pick up any treasure. Add in slightly more knowledgeable enthusiasts, and the area was crowded. Compared with the aloof and arrogant air of top big shots, the visitors here weren't reserved at all. A lot of people here were homebody techies. When it came to skills, they didn't care about anything, and would just spout off. Can't take it anymore? Then pack up and go home, otherwise, fight it out if you're a man. Their thoughts were just this crude and simple. Who cared about dignity or the situation? When it came to their interests, there was only one word to describe their thinking: argue. As a result, there would be a lot of fighting from time to time among the independent booths. Like some super fertilizer that could be converted into an astonishing new energy source, or repackaged in new and exotic ways, someone in front of the booth might suddenly point out a problem with that. In the end, both parties would talk until they got agitated and had to use physical means to make the other side see reason. Luke and Selena weren't in a hurry to stop them either. Only after both parties had beaten each other until their faces were badly battered did they step forward with big grins to restrain them. They took turns going forward to say, "Will you settle this privately and promise not to disturb public order at the expo again? Or do you want to cool down together in the police detention center for 24 hours? Naturally, most of the homebody techies were rendered speechless. They had already fought and the anger had already passed, but the proof was still on their faces. They couldn't deny it. Some of them were still stubborn, and could only be sent to the detention center for real. Luke and Selena were very familiar with this procedure. During the Stark Expo in LA, they had sent almost 100 people to the police department in just a few days. Breaking up this sort of scuffle only gave Luke 3 experience and credit points at most each time. However, these fights happened often and quickly, and Luke was able to earn 100+ points in half a day. The police had already prepared 2 big prison buses inside the venue. Those who refused to obey were handcuffed and loaded onto the bus. Once it was full, the vehicle would take them to the detention center. Following what happened at the LA Expo, Stark Industries had bought an old factory in Nassau County a month ago, converted it into a detention center, and handed it over to the state government. Inside this newly constructed detention center were 5,000 stainless steel beds calmly waiting for Expo troublemakers to check in. If needed, temporary beds could also be added, and the detention center could house up to 8,000 people. When you were rich, you could do whatever you wanted. In any case, there was no need for a court trial or whatever to detain someone in the center. Troublemakers caught at the scene could be sent there to cool their heads for 24 hours. This was the power of the police. If they still didn't calm down after they were released, they could try being detained again a few more times before they were officially arrested. NYPD also sent out some police personnel and support to maintain order. They didn't have to worry about the pay. Stark Industries had donated a huge sum to NYPD. If NYPD didn't do their best, then the commissioner and bureau chief could start counting down to when they would be kicked out of office. There were a lot of minor problems at the venue, but they were all resolved very quickly, and even the most raucous independent vendors' booths settled down. But not all the inventions and products here were complete rubbish. It had to be said that the products had to be at a certain level of technology in order to be able to pass the administrative department's vetting process. But these homebody techies running their mouths off to pull in investments was common. For example, the way they bragged about some new energy technology, people would think that Tony Stark's arc reactor was already outdated, but the truth was that they still had to promote their products at Tony's Expo. Thus, when Luke and Selena went for a walk to digest the food after they had lunch, they would visit the independent booths. Today, they ran into a familiar face. A small figure was standing in front of a booth and drooling over a slightly heavy-looking solo jetpack. Luke walked over and pressed down on the girl's braids, rubbing her head before she realized what was going on. "Why are you alone? Where's your father?" She turned around and smiled when she saw Luke. "Ah, Luke, you're here too." Then, she lunged forward happily and hugged the dog head next to Luke's feet. "Ah, Dollar, you're here too. Did you miss me?" Gold Nugget was too lazy to deal with the little girl. It let Dollar, who liked kids, take control of its body, and the dog wagged its tail as it licked that small face. "Humph, bootlicker. You're destined to be nothing." The dog had snorted disdainfully at the fool whom it shared bodies with. After the girl played with the dog for a while, Luke said, "Mindy, you didn't come here alone, did you?" Mindy was a better fighter than most men here, but it was indeed a little too careless of Damon to let her wander around on her own. Mindy hugged the dog and pressed her face against its fur. "Dad's over there." Luke looked in the direction she was pointing, and saw Damon sitting at a booth and talking to another man. He found that odd. "Isn't your father drawing now? Why is he selling products?" Mindy said, "No, the booth owner is his friend. He's just chatting there." "Then let's go say hi," said Luke as he walked over. Mindy reluctantly let go of Dollar's big dog head and followed. Walking over to the booth and looking at the items on display, Luke smiled at the middle-aged booth owner and called out, "Damon, you're not here to sell drawings, are you?" Damon was amused. "I was just looking around, and just happened to run into my friend." "Oh, let me introduce you. This is Luke, and this is Bent." Luke shook hands with Bent and read the descriptions on the table. He glanced at something that looked like a walkie-talkie on the table, before he asked with a strange expression, "How effective is this device?" A little nervous, Bent stood up. "Very good, I guarantee it's good." Luke couldn't help but read the description again. "Sick stick, releases a powerful pulse and causes discomfort. There are multiple modes to choose from, Mode 1 stomach, Mode 2. Pondering for a moment, Luke asked, "Can I try it out?" Bent was stunned, but Damon subconsciously stopped Luke. "No." Seeing Luke's gaze, he quickly said, "This thing is a little strong. It's best if you don't use it here." Damon knew Luke's identity as a detective. If this guy treated this sick stick like a regular taser and used it on some troublemaker, it would be a mess. Bent was the classic homebody techie who frequently had a few screws loose. It was for this reason that he was one of the first to be laid off by the Department of Defense. Without a job, he had used up his meager savings after a few months. When he heard that there would be an area for independent booths at the expo, Bent took out the odd things he had invented to try and sell them so that he could go home and continue inventing. As long as he sold enough this time, the guy wouldn't mind being holed up at home for a few more years. Also, Bent didn't want Damon's money. He firmly believed that he wasn't a beggar, but a scientist. There would always be people who admired his skills. This taser that he had invented was no more lethal than an ordinary taser, but it was very technologically unique, which was why Bent had been let into the expo. Damon, who had tested this sick stick on a drug dealer, knew that the crux was that this thing wasn't fatal, but that it had a huge impact on the five senses of onlookers, so much so that most people couldn't take it. Luke took the hint. Damon was a reliable person who didn't talk nonsense. If he said not to use it here, that definitely meant that there was something wrong with the sick stick. Luke put down the description and started reading the rest. Bent had brought in more than one type of product, and this sick stick wasn't exactly high-tech. He had packed a bunch of small inventions. It was also because of these things that his boss had been determined to kick him out of the Department of Defense. Luke spent a minute skimming through the descriptions before he looked at Bent. "What do you do?" "These are all non-lethal weapons." Bent murmured, I used to be in the Department of Defense, and I specialize in developing control-type weapons." He was afraid that Luke wouldn't understand, so he added, "It's mainly for use in riots and illegal gatherings, not to kill people." Luke nodded thoughtfully. You're quite good." These items were indeed similar in kind, but emphasized different points. Putting aside the sick stick, there were other very interesting things like farting medicine, cramping oil, and itching powder. The biggest problem with these inventions was that no department was willing to buy them since they looked more like practical jokes. They might be effective, but they were a little too conspicuous and could only be used in a public operation. But in that sort of situation, the police and agents would have flash grenades and tear gas grenades, and rubber bullets were also useful. There was no need to order these costly special products. To use one word to describe these inventions, they were worthless. Thinking that, Luke looked at Bent's booth, and realized that except for the inventions and descriptions, there weren't any promotional materials. Although there were descriptions for the inventions, there should also be flyers or name cards with contact details on them. But there were no flyers or name cards on Bent's table. Unless the deal was made on the spot, it would be hard for him to find buyers. Without buyers, he could only go home. Luke said helplessly, "Bent, do you have a name card?" Bent scratched his head. "No, I hardly come out. I don't need one." Luke was rendered speechless by the man's honesty. He took out a pink permanent marker from his pocket and gave it to him. "I think you should at least write down your number. Not everybody will fork out money on the spot. They'll take your contact and think about it before buying. You have to give clients a chance to think about it." Damon was immediately embarrassed. He had never thought of that at all. He had just seen an old friend, and came over to chat. Bent slapped his forehead. "I didn't think about that. Thank you, Luke." He then wrote down a number on the table with the pink marker and gave it back. "You can keep it." Luke's lips twitched. This guy had actually written down his number on the table. The pink number was indeed eye-catching on the white table, but the table belonged to the organizers. This was a plaything which Luke had made for Selena. The biggest thing about it was that it was very pink, and secondly, it was very hard to wash off. Not knowing that he had wrecked the organizer's property, Bent thanked Luke profusely. Amused, Luke accepted it and said goodbye to Bent, Damon and Mindy. Mindy touched the dog's head and felt it lick her again. She was reluctant. "Dad, can I take a spin with Luke and Selena?" Damon thought for a moment before he nodded. He trusted them, and Mindy wouldn't run into any trouble if she was with the two detectives. In the afternoon, Mindy followed them, or more precisely, followed Dollar around the venue. Luke and Selena basically just drove around and didn't get out unless they noticed something. Mindy and Gold Nugget were in the back seat. One girl and one dog stared at the cat and mouse on the tablet. Gold Nugget itself didn't watch cartoons. It felt that this sort of thing was too childish and unsuitable for a mature and smart dog like it. While it still felt like this even now, the little girl was pretty nice, so it decided to endure it a little and watch with her. "It's not me, it's definitely Dollar." That was what the dog had thought to itself. Luke, Selena and Gold Nugget had to eat huge amounts every day for the calories and nutrition, so there were plenty of snacks in the car. Very soon, Mindy was eating and feeding Gold Nugget in the back seat. Gold Nugget was very satisfied. When Luke fed it, it was a reward. If he dared to act spoiled, he would be threatened with a "I'll blow your head off." Also, Selena fed it half-heartedly. When she was in a good mood, she would feed it constantly, and when she was in a bad mood, it had to help her out. Right now, Mindy was feeding it considerately. Gold Nugget only needed to open its mouth, and the cake was at its lips. Unfortunately, the fiend didn't allow it to overindulge outside, and only gave it 20 cupcakes. In the end, Mindy gave half of her cupcake to the dog, so it found this little human very pleasing now, and it touched the little girl's head with its paw. Yes, every time the fiend touched it like this, it felt very comfortable. If he touched the little girl like this, she would be very happy too, right? A certain dog head was very confident in its learning ability. The little girl giggled, which made it feel that it had done the right thing. In the afternoon, Luke and Selena got off work, and Mindy was reluctant to part with Gold Nugget. Eventually, she stayed for dinner, and Luke drove her home. On the way home, Mindy couldn't help but make a small request, and asked if she could play with Gold Nugget during the holidays. Luke thought for a moment before agreeing. However, he told her to call before she came over, to make sure that they were at home. Gold Nugget was fine. It spent its days watching dramas and scolding people on online forums. Every now and then, it would go out with Selena to beat up people in order to balance out its mood. It had a rich life. Dollar liked to play with people and was full of energy after Gold Nugget formed a symbiotic relationship with it, but the two people at home didn't have that much time to accompany it. As long as Mindy was willing, it wasn't a problem for her to visit Gold Nugget once or twice a week. Now that she had gotten permission, the little girl was in a very good mood. She even hummed a song. Luke remembered that she should be in school by now, so he casually asked her about it. Only then did he learn that she had transferred to a junior high school and was currently in the 7th grade. Mindy's middle school life had clearly started out well. She was already far more knowledgeable than the other 7th grade students, and she had good grades. Thanks to her athletic abilities, she had joined the cheerleaders at school not long ago, and had a good relationship with some of the 9th grade team members. Luke had a strange expression on his face when he heard that. I may have gone to high school in the middle of nowhere in Texas, but cheerleaders always have their little secrets. Are you sure there's nothing wrong with those girls? Mindy was stumped. What do you mean? Looking at her, Luke knew that while she wasn't stupid, she had never been to school, and didn't know about the rotten things cheerleaders could get up to. Of course, she would learn if she watched more shows for preteens, but she mostly chose to watch cartoons. So, he explained, when I was in high school, I had a friend who was a cheerleader, and my sister was a cheerleader too. So, it might not be accurate to say that all cheerleaders are bad. However, they also said that there were a lot of B*cheese in the cheerleading team who liked to play dirty tricks behind other people's backs and bully new team members. Mindy was stunned. Really? Luke sighed. It's usually a small group of 2 to 4 people. They're a little wealthier and dress on trend. They'll usually have a boyfriend or two, and like to flaunt their clothes, perfume, jewelry, purses, phones, and the number of boyfriends they have in front of ordinary girls. Mindy's eyes widened. She murmured, It seems they're like that. They invited me to a party this weekend. Luke shook his head. Although these sorts of people are usually pranksters and will only pull hair or slap people at most when they bully them, most girls still won't be able to take it. Mindy was lost. Why would they do that? If they wanted to make fun of me, they wouldn't have made friends with me, right? Luke said, because they like to see other people fall into a trap before jumping out to mock them for being idiots. It's a typical case of having a little bit of sick fun. It's only when you're not fooled that they'll stop pretending. Mindy frowned and was conflicted. No way. I think they're quite nice, although they are a little catty. Luke rubbed her head and said, Now that I've warned you, aren't you going to check it out? It's easy to investigate the reputation of someone like that in school. Go and ask a slightly weaker and more honest student. No matter what they say, you'll be able to confirm it yourselves. Mindy hesitated. Should I really check it out? Luke nodded. Isn't it normal to see how other people treat their good friends? How can a good friend blame you for something like this? Mindy gave a somewhat lackluster, oh. Luke rubbed her head again. Don't think that your classmates are all bad. It's just that there are slightly more rotten eggs among cheerleaders. You're a girl, so you should protect yourself. Actually, he wasn't too worried about Mindy, he was worried about what she would do to the cheerleaders. Most of these so-called pranks in school were mostly to humiliate the other party, and could even go so far as to become a crime. If they really pissed off this little girl, those girls might not die on the spot, but they would very likely have to be sent to the ICU. Looking at Mindy's downcast face, he thought for a moment before he said, I think I know 2 friends at Dalton Junior High. They're also cheerleaders. I'll ask them about the situation. How does that sound? Mindy hesitated for a moment before she nodded. Luke pulled over and dialed a number. Monica? This is Luke. Which Luke? The Luke who treated you to Shake Shack twice. Mindy, on the other hand, had a strange expression on her face. Although the burgers there were very delicious, he dared to call them friends just after treating them twice to a meal. These friends seemed very cheap. While she was letting her thoughts run wild, Luke got to the point. Here's the thing, I have a little sister who just transferred into the 7th grade and is a cheerleader. I'm afraid she'll be bullied in that group, so I want to ask. A moment later, he put down the phone and said, there's only one group of ninth grade cheerleaders on the team. Their leader is called Brooke. She's from a middle-class family and likes to dye her hair blonde. She acts like a rich young lady and has two female lackeys. One of them is called Harlow, and the other is called Dolce. Mindy sighed and didn't say anything. Luke patted her head and said, it seems that I was right. They're the good friends you met. Don't be sad. Most people in high school would be lucky to make one or two good friends. That'll take a few years. Thinking for a moment, he asked, when will the cheerleaders get together? Mindy said, there's a training session tomorrow at 9 a.m. Luke was amused. I'll take leave tomorrow to take you to the training. Mindy turned her head in surprise. Huh? Luke patted the little girl's head again. Just say that I'm your cousin. It won't be easy for them to mess with you after tomorrow. Mindy's expression turned strange. Are you sure? Luke chuckled. It's just a small matter. What's there to be nervous about? Mindy's eyes sparkled as she pondered. She and her father were passing friends with Luke, and they barely had dealings with each other. Why was he so nice to her? Did he really think of her as a sister? Mindy was a little bewildered. Of course, Luke wouldn't tell her that he was just trying to improve her good impression of him. This little girl was one of the few one-star teammates who had passed the system's evaluation. Based on when she became his teammate, he didn't need to work hard to impress this little girl, doing something small was enough to give her a very good impression of him. Pretending to be her cousin and making an appearance to help her solve a small problem with some of her classmates truly took no time and effort. After all the cheerleaders were girls. The next morning, Selena and Gold Nugget went out on patrol in the car. Luke, on the other hand, drove a barely used car out of the garage on the first floor and headed to Damon's house on the other side of the river. After he stopped the car in front of Damon's house, he honked, and Mindy quickly opened the door and walked out. Damon followed her out and was about to say hi to Luke, but both father and daughter were stunned when they saw the car. Mindy couldn't help but exclaim, "Cool." Her gloomy mood was suddenly tossed to the side as she circled Luke's car and examined it. Damon was about the same. At most, he had slightly more self-control than Mindy, and there was a nostalgic look on his face. I wanted a car like this back then, but I didn't have much money. This car of yours. Did you modify it yourself? Luke nodded with a smile. When I bought it, it was very shabby. Actually, only the outside looked a little like it, the rest weren't original parts. Damon shook his head regretfully. What a shame. If it isn't the original, it's not as meaningful. Mindy, however, mumbled on the side, "Dad, this is Knight Rider's kit. Even if it's modified, I want one." She then looked at Luke. Can it talk? Luke said, yes, but it's not that smart. It also won't get angry and lock me out. Mindy asked, can it take a photo of something that's several hundred meters away? Luke, yes. Mindy asked, can it control any electronic equipment? Luke said, some. Not the complicated ones. Mindy asked, then, is it bulletproof, heat-resistant, and waterproof? Luke said, not waterproofing, that's too troublesome. Mindy nodded regretfully. That's true. After all, this is reality. Then, it can't fly. Luke was amused. I would prefer to call it gliding. It's part of the design, but the effect isn't obvious. Mindy asked, then, can you take me flying once? Luke, sure. Damon and Mindy's admiration of the car lasted for 2 minutes before they put it aside. The car was Luke's. They would definitely have a chance to see it in the future. Also, Mindy was going to take the car to school, which was perfect. Mindy felt a lot better after this interlude. As they chatted, Luke found it funny. Did this little girl also have some sort of homebody personality? Right, she seemed to like comics, and even superhero ones. Her knowledge wasn't from TV shows, but from comics adapted from them. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this little girl was a homebody. It was just that Damon had led her down a different path early on, which made her seem very mature. In fact, there wasn't much of a difference between her and other loner girls. She didn't have friends, didn't socialize, liked to train, liked comics, and liked certain machines and industrial products. Perhaps that was why she valued her 3 new friends. Just because many loners didn't have friends didn't mean that they didn't want any. It was just that they couldn't make friends. Labeling the little girl next to him a homebody, his car soon reached Dalton Junior High. Dalton Junior High was in Manhattan and on the Upper East Side. Not far away was Central Park, known as the lungs of New York, and which was diagonally across from Clinton. The car was only stopped at the school gate for a moment before it easily drove in. Mindy found that odd. "Your car can enter." Luke chuckled. "Well, I have a contact here." Of course, he wouldn't say that he himself didn't know the contact. Supposedly, it was some member of the school board. It was the weekend, and the school was a lot quieter than usual. However, there were still a lot of team activities going on. The pitch-black kit was unusual and attracted a lot of attention, mostly from guys, when it drove through the campus. When it stopped next to the basketball court, Mindy got out of the car under the eyes of the girls outside. Few girls in the cheerleading team were shy. They surrounded her almost immediately with curious and inquisitive looks. "Hi, Mindy. Is this your boyfriend?" Mindy was stunned. "Huh?" She couldn't help but look at Luke, who was next to her, and mumbled to herself, "I'm only 13. Why would I find a 20-year-old boyfriend? Aren't all of you a little too precocious?" The truth was that Mindy got plenty of exercise, and thanks to her secondary profession, she had the air of a 14 or 15-year-old. It was just that she had a bit of a baby face. These girls were all older at around 15 or 16, so the age gap with Luke was smaller. It wasn't strange at all to them that Mindy could find an older boyfriend like Luke. Luke gave his trademark sunny smile and waved at the girls. "Hi, I'm Mindy's cousin. Just call me Luke." A moment later, Mindy looked with a conflicted expression at her cousin, who was surrounded by her teammates. "Brother, are you my biological brother? Are you here to hook up with my classmates, or are you here to help me?" Luke had no intention of cozying up to the girls. He was only here to tell the cheerleaders that Mindy had a tough brother, and not just anyone could bully her. To be precise, no one could bully her. It was very easy to deliberately draw attention. Luke knew very well what these girls were interested in. For example, celebrities. Who was the biggest and hottest star in the world recently? It wasn't anyone in the entertainment circle, but Tony Stark and Iron Man. He simply talked up some little anecdotes about Tony and made it sound like he had been there, which was more than enough. Being at the scene was something worth bragging about. Besides, many people knew Tony Stark very well, but nobody knew more about Iron Man than Luke. What he said fitted Tony's character very well, and was very interesting. The little girls were already listening with glowing faces. At that moment, a few more girls walked over. One of them, a girl with blonde waves who looked like she was 25 years old, looked at Mindy with ridicule at first, before she looked at the car with suspicion and then interest. She couldn't help but ask her companions in a low voice, "Is that a branded car? Why haven't I seen it before?" Her 2 companions shook their heads. The 3 of them knew a lot about the latest luxury cars. However, they really didn't have any impression of the logo on the black sports car not far away. The blonde couldn't help but ask, "That man's my type. I'll go up first, okay?" Her 2 companions smiled lightly and nodded, even as they cursed her inwardly. Of course, it didn't matter who went first. There wasn't much of an advantage in going first when it came to hooking up with guys, who were greedy and easily swayed. The three girls soon walked over with perfect smiles as they arrogantly cut into Luke and the girls' conversation. Luke pretended not to notice and maintained his previous attitude. The sunny smile and his interesting story amused the 7 or 8 girls. Mindy, as his cousin, was still in a daze. "Cousin, when you said you would help me deal with those 3B** cheese, did you mean you would suck them in like this?" It does seem this will fix the problem. I guess." But when she saw Luke surrounded by the girls, Mindy somehow felt like she was losing out. With this sort of cousin, she would rather beat up those 3B** cheese than let Luke hawk his charms to achieve his goal. They chatted for a few minutes, and the cheerleaders who had entered the basketball court earlier couldn't resist following the crowd as they gathered around. At that moment, someone greeted Luke. "Hey, Luke, you're here so early. It seems you're having fun." Luke stopped chatting and walked over with a smile. "Hey, Nikki, Monica. It's been a while. Seeing you puts me in an even better mood." He gave each girl a half hug and pressed their cheeks together. The cheerleaders were all surprised, including Mindy. Except for Luke, everyone else were high school students. It was very rare to see this sort of greeting among high school students, especially between a guy and a girl. This clearly proved that Luke and the two girls were more than just passing acquaintances. Then, he pulled Mindy, who had been stunned for a long time, over. "My cousin. You've probably known each other for a while." Nikki and Monica immediately pulled the short Mindy over and laughed, saying things like, "You hid your elder cousin so well." Mindy was dumbfounded. "I only found out today that I have a cousin. My bad." Luke apologized to the other girls with a smile, before he led Mindy, Nikki and Monica to a tree in the distance. At that moment, Monica nudged Luke with her elbow. "It's a good thing you called yesterday. But are you sure you want us to be blunt? You have to know that the truth is always a blow." Luke chuckled. "It's fine. Mindy's my cousin. She won't be affected so easily." Mindy was still dumbfounded. Monica and Luke were actually so close. Wasn't they just burger friends? Nikki nodded and said, "Monica told me last night that your cousin is hanging around with those B** cheese. We knew that it wasn't a good thing. Those 3 people like to bully newbies the most, unless they obediently follow the trio and suck up to them." Saying that, she turned and looked at Mindy. "They invited you to a party in 2 days, didn't they? The boy who invited you was Simon, right?" Mindy nodded blankly. Monica sighed and continued, "Simon is Brooke's playmate. He often helps her deal with newbies whom they find unpleasant to the eye. If it's those 2 who persuaded you to go to this party, it'll only be humiliation waiting for you." Seeing no reaction from Mindy, she turned around and looked at Luke. "Aren't we being too blunt?" Luke shrugged. "It's fine. It's better than her happily following the boy to the party and then being humiliated by a bunch of people." Monica gave an "oh" and said comfortingly, "Of course, that won't happen now. We'll look after Mindy. They're just good-for-nothings who use numbers to bully newbies. They don't dare provoke our group at all." Luke asked with great interest, "Your group?" He glanced at Nikki. Nikki subconsciously explained, "It's not a bad group. Monica and I set up a girls' self-defense club." Luke nodded and patted Mindy's head. "Are you interested in another club? Girls should learn to protect themselves when they're outside." Hesitating for a moment, Mindy then nodded. "Okay, I'm in." Monica hugged her with a smile. "Don't worry. Our club is more relaxed. It's just for the girls to learn some basic self-defense skills. We don't force them to participate in any activities." At that moment, Luke raised his hand and looked at his watch. "The cheerleaders' training is about to start. You can go first. After training, how about we have lunch together?" The 3 girls had no objections and entered the indoor basketball court with smiles on their faces. Luke didn't leave. He sat in the car and wrote and drew on his phone. For him, he could always work anywhere. From gathering intelligence and designing blueprints for new armor, to coming up with various plans for the future, and even creating some small inventions for the expansion under Jenny, he could make use of all his bits and pieces of his time and not waste any. But it was almost 11 o'clock, and many boys who were here to pick up their girlfriends had already gathered around the car. What they were really interested in wasn't Luke, but his car. So, by the time the cheerleaders were done with their training and came out, they saw a scene similar to the morning, except that the bystanders were now guys. 7 or 8 guys were discussing Luke's car. Luke wasn't enthusiastic, but he wasn't cold either. He answered their questions every now and then. Fortunately, the guys could fuss over some of the car's minor modifications themselves, so Luke didn't have to deal with them too much. A moment later, Luke picked up his cousin and disappeared from sight. Brooke's expression was awful. She wasn't an idiot. Luke had found Nikki and Monica, those 2 crazy girls, and was clearly threatening her. Also, his attitude toward Brooke was clearly different. He either pretended not to hear her, or just laughed and spoke to her perfunctorily. Clearly, Mindy's cousin knew that Brooke wanted to mess with her, and was here to back Mindy up. She couldn't afford to offend Nikki and Monica, but she wasn't afraid of the guys here. Hearing them still discussing the car, she said disdainfully, isn't it just a lousy discontinued model? It's not a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. Why is he playing around with an old car? He has no taste. In the end, guys were a little more stupid than girls. A guy who had been engrossed in the discussion just now subconsciously sneered. A lousy car. A Ferrari or Lamborghini is nothing. That's Kit. Haven't you watched Knight Rider? Brooke had no clue what he was talking about and retorted without hesitation, isn't that just some dumb thing you'd *MN homebuddies play with? How old is he? He might as well just buy a transformer and play with it at home. The boy flushed. You idiot. That's the original model in the TV show, and this car has been modified to look like it. You can buy an ordinary Lamborghini if you're just thinking about modifying the parts. Also, if you don't have any connections, you won't be able to find a tech whiz to modify your car for you. Don't think that anybody would be willing to modify your car like that for you even if you gave them $200,000. The other guys clearly agreed with him and nodded. If they stood on Brooke's side, wouldn't that prove that drooling over Kit was stupid and low class? The guy who had spoken liked tinkering with cars. He usually drove a Mustang, and would brag about the cost and trouble of modifying the car, which showed that he knew what he was talking about. It was also the reason why he was more popular with the girls. Strictly speaking, however, he was indeed a bit like the *MN homebuddy nerds Brooke had mentioned. Brooke had derided his expertise in front of so many students. If he didn't make things clear on the spot, he would be labeled a nerd and wouldn't be able to attract girls in the future. A half-nerd wouldn't give up. It was very hard for someone to get a girl to like them if they didn't stand out on campus. He continued to go off at Brooke. Do you think you're so great just because you're rich and can buy perfume, bags, CDs of British bands or whatever? You're just a brainless *TCH. Do you know that guys like to get their cars modified? If they see this kid, they'll hug Luke's leg and call him Dad, understand? No, you don't understand. A brainless *TCH like you only has Simon's *CK in your head. Except for yapping all day, you can't do anything else. After a brief silence, many people roared with laughter. A lot of the cheerleaders didn't get along with Brooke, and most of the guys had nothing to do with them. It was just that Brooke had a lot of connections among the school sports players, so everyone was disinclined to provoke this annoying person. Now that they weren't the ones lashing out at her, nobody wanted to hold back when they saw her being made a fool of, so they all laughed. Many of the girls who had grudges against Brooke laughed especially happily. What a poser. Part of this was due to the boy's popularity at school. Everybody knew that he understood car modifications. On top of that, everybody had seen Luke's car. That pitch-black model was unique, and the interior looked very futuristic. It was obvious that it wasn't a cheap car. The most important thing was, Luke's looks. Given Luke's looks and his bright, confident smile, along with the wealth which the car hinted at, anyone would think that Brooke was the one with no taste. The guys should have hated someone like Luke, who was too strong a competitor, but Brooke had just categorized everyone who liked cars as nerds, and there were a number of people here who liked cars. For a moment, nobody wanted to help her. On the other side, Luke had lunch with his cousin, Nikki and Monica. They had lunch at a Mexican restaurant. It wasn't very expensive, but the ambience and dishes were more unique. Few people came here for lunch. Their group was young and didn't have to hold back when eating. They chatted as they ate. Mindy's mood improved significantly. She had almost been tricked by Brooke's group, which was a huge blow to her as a newbie. But thanks to Luke, this newly minted cousin, she had gotten to know Nikki and Monica, these two new friends, which made her even happier. From their conversation, Luke and Mindy learned that Nikki and Monica were actually combat enthusiasts. They had opened the girls' self-defense club for fun. Most of the girls who joined just learned some basic safety knowledge, they didn't encourage the girls to take risks. In Monica's words, the best self-defense for ordinary girls were a taser and pepper spray. Using these two items at the right time was far more effective than learning some self-defense technique. Including Nikki and Monica, only 5 or 6 core members of the girls' self-defense club were real combat enthusiasts. Nikki and Monica were more candid in their manner. Coupled with their mutual interest in fighting, Mindy felt that this was the perfect group for her. She couldn't be a loner. Loners in school were usually regarded as freaks or nerds. It was very easy for them to fall into a situation where they were bullied and nobody helped them. Mindy wasn't afraid of getting into a physical fight, but she didn't have any experience dealing with verbal or emotional abuse, and could easily become withdrawn. Naturally, she wouldn't be like that now. While they were chatting, Mindy suddenly dug a hole for Luke. She inadvertently mentioned that he was very good at combat, and that pro fighters were nothing in comparison. Fine, it was because Mindy had become very comfortable with Nikki and Monica. Even if it was the truth, Luke was still a little embarrassed. That was because Nikki and Monica immediately looked over. It was no longer just purely with the good impression they had of him from before, but with the joy of meeting a kindred spirit. Monica seemed to sense that he was about to say something, and immediately beat him to it. She said that it was better for everyone to spar together and treat it as welcoming Mindy to the group. He had asked them for help today, and since he couldn't throw them away after using them, he could only agree with a smile. As for the so-called spar, he could only cooperate a little and teach them for an hour. After paying the bill and leaving, Luke called Damon to let him know what was going on. Then, the 4 of them drove to the address which Nikki provided. When they arrived at the address, Luke realized that it wasn't a gym or a combat training ground, but Nikki's house. Her family wasn't poor, but she wasn't exactly rich. However, her parents were good to her, and she had an individual gym. Looking at the fitness and training equipment in the gym, Luke became even more certain. He couldn't help but make a joke. "Should I call you, young miss from now on, Nikki?" After having lunch together and taking on the task of taking care of Luke's cousin, Nikki no longer felt so nervous around him. Hearing that, she rolled her eyes at him. "I should be the one calling you, young master, right? You can even make a kit. Don't pretend to be low-key." Luke shrugged. "I usually drive an SUV. I was just afraid that Mindy would be mocked for her brother being so old-fashioned." "Huh?" Mindy looked at him blankly. But she immediately understood. She had seen Luke a few times, and he drove either an SUV or a very normal-looking household vehicle. He had really driven this car today to give her face. Even junior high kids knew how money worked in society. But Luke was very careful. He hadn't just used a car that looked expensive, but a modified one. A third-generation Pontiac wasn't that expensive, what was expensive were the modifications. But how much the modifications cost was a very personal question, and everybody could only make a guess. Coupled with the fact that this car was the prototype for the popular TV show Knight Rider, from more than 10 years ago, and thus had some nostalgic value, it became more than purely showing off, and was about class and style. Students would more readily accept this sort of thing, and it wouldn't turn into hating on the rich. Like the homebuddy tech guy said, the ways Brooke flaunted her wealth couldn't compare with Luke's subtle bragging. Naturally, Luke's main goal wasn't to suppress Brooke. She was the stereotypical rich schoolgirl who was nothing more than a fly he was swatting in passing. He was putting on fake airs for Mindy's sake. After today, any young miss or master who came looking for Mindy had to have enough capital. First of all, they had to be rich enough to easily fork out hundreds of thousands of dollars to modify their car for fun, and secondly, their own technical skills had to be good enough. Otherwise, they weren't qualified to provoke Mindy. There was also an additional condition for the guys: they had to be as handsome as Luke. Luke didn't think that many junior high school guys could meet all these requirements. Ultimately, however, if Mindy was still bullied for no reason, the group leader would very likely be beaten up. There were very few junior high school kids who could fight better than Mindy. Mindy was still deep in thought when Monica sat down next to her and handed her a bottle of mineral water. She jerked her chin at the two people who had already started to discuss the spar. "You weren't bragging about your brother, right? Nikki is quite good. When we fight seriously, I'm not her match." Mindy came back to her senses. Hearing that, she looked at Monica strangely. "You're overthinking it." Monica wasn't stupid. Hearing that, she knew that her worries were misplaced. "Is Luke that good?" Mindy chuckled and took a sip. "Don't worry. If he's just playing around, he probably won't hurt you." Monica stared at her. "Your skills were indeed quite good when you passed the team entrance exam. So, you have a good foundation in combat?" Mindy scrunched up her nose cutely. "Shall we try it later?" Monica stretched out her right fist. "Let's do that." Mindy looked at her fist and then bumped it with her own. "All right." Nikki and Luke were already standing in place. To return the favor today, Luke readily agreed to a match and would let her do her best until she conceded on her own. Even if he defeated her, he still had to think of other ways to lose so that the girl wouldn't become unlucky. Both parties put on gloves and protective gear to avoid getting hurt. Luke wasn't afraid, but he didn't want to look like he was looking down on Nikki, so he put on the protective gear to avoid getting Nikki's hands hurt. Putting his hands up in a very ordinary boxing pose, he beckoned for her to start. Nikki didn't waste any time. With a light yell, her punches rained down like a storm. Professional. That was Luke's first impression. Nikki demonstrated the strength of a professional fighter with her opening attack. She wasn't at the level of an amateur as Luke had thought. Also, when she saw him easily block her punches with the standard boxing stance, she gradually punched faster and stronger. A minute later, Mindy was very surprised. She nudged Monica. "Are the core members of your combat club all female UFC fighters?" Monica watched Luke's every move. "No. Nikki is just doing some daily training there. If she does her best, only I can barely be her sparring partner." Mindy was surprised. "You can fight her?" She was watching the details of Luke and Nikki's battle from up close. Nikki might not necessarily lose to her in a private match like this. Of course, Mindy would definitely kill Nikki instantly in a real fight, but that was because their fighting experience and requirements were different. With Nikki's skills, as long as she didn't show any mercy in killing drug dealers like Mindy, she had a 50-50 chance of winning. Mindy really hadn't expected that. If Monica could fight Nikki, then she wasn't much weaker than Mindy. No wonder the two girls were so confident when they talked about fighting. They really weren't ordinary enthusiasts. At that moment, it wasn't Mindy who was the most shocked, but Nikki and Monica. They had been hiding their strength all this time since they had no use for it. They only met in the 7th grade, and had just been ordinary acquaintances then. But the two of them had accidentally bumped into each other at a nightclub. Monica had snuck in for a look, but was harassed by a bunch of hoodlums. Monica had completely looked down on them. After leading them into a dark alley, a fight broke out. Not far away, Nikki saw Monica being forced into an alley by a bunch of hoodlums. Even though they didn't know each other that well, she still went to help out. After entering the alley, she saw Monica fighting a dozen hoodlums. Nikki attacked without hesitation. Together, they knocked out the dozen or so hoodlums. It could be said that they grew close after a fight. Their extraordinary combat ability was their shared secret. Everybody in the gym had different thoughts, but Luke was the most surprised. As he attacked, the strength which Nikki displayed increased, and so did her reflexes. She was physically even stronger than Selena without Gold Nugget as a symbiotic host, and only lacked experience and reflexes. But Selena had been on a training regime for half a year. At the same time, Gold Nugget absorbed the special energy in her body every day before sending it back. Her physique improved steadily, and she was now twice as strong as an ordinary person. Nikki was only a high school student. How could she be stronger than Selena, who had a cheat? Superhuman. Surprise flashed through his mind. After thinking for a moment, he decisively decided to beat Nikki fairly. Not accepting this God-given opportunity would be a crime. He would compensate Nikki later. Making up his mind, he didn't take action immediately, but observed Nikki more carefully. Nikki was a tall, white girl. At 16, she was still rather thin. Whether it was her limbs or her waist, she looked very different from a strength-type fighter. Or rather, she shouldn't be so strong given her physique. The way she hit Luke with her fists, an ordinary girl would have already broken her arms. Nikki, however, was unperturbed, and even grew more excited the more she fought. At that moment, she warned him, "Be careful. I'm going to use more combat skills. Don't just focus on my fists." Luke nodded with a smile. "Just nice, I can try something else too." As she spoke, Nikki took 2 steps back and switched from boxing to a UFC fighting style, and her movements became even more nimble. When Luke's stance changed, Nikki's eyes lit up. "Muay Thai?" Luke chuckled but didn't answer. This wasn't Muay Thai. As long as the situation was right, he could use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to take her down in the next second. But seeing that Nikki might be able to give him an ability, he decided to let her be happy for a bit. Mindy and Monica, who were sitting on the side, didn't say anything. They couldn't take their eyes off the other two, and waited for an even more brilliant fight. Sure enough, boxing, Muay Thai, karate and judo all made an appearance in the following fight. Luke and Nikki's battleground expanded from the center to the entire gym. The two of them were like agile monkeys. All sorts of fitness equipment became support props for their attacks and defense. They jumped and moved, and didn't miss any opportunity to attack the other party. This made the match resemble actual combat even more. Mindy and Monica couldn't take their eyes off him. They were both very surprised. They didn't expect the other party's cousin/best friend to be so strong. Then, nothing. Luke suddenly approached Nikki and took 2 of her punches head-on before locking her right arm in place. Nikki struggled for 5 seconds before she simply patted the ground and conceded. When Luke got up, she smiled and pulled herself up. Rubbing her right arm, she said in disbelief, "You can suppress me with your strength?" Amused, Luke raised his arm to show off his muscles. "Young lady, I trained as well. You're strong enough to crush regular guys, but not strong enough to lift 200 pounds with one hand, so you don't stand a chance." Nikki thought for a moment and accepted the fact. She shook her head with a bitter smile. "I've always felt that my fists are strong enough. I've always focused on footwork. It looks like I also need to practice ground fighting. Luke nodded. You don't have to force yourself if you don't like it. You just need to focus on some defense training against ground fighting techniques. Few people are good at all combat skills. Choose the best approach for yourself and play to your strengths. As they talked, they walked to the side. Mindy and Monica heard everything clearly and agreed with Luke. There was a limit to a person's energy, and talent wasn't omnipotent. Rather than learn everything and not master anything, it was more practical to train in the area you had talent in. After Nikki sat down, Luke looked at Monica with a smile. Are we going to go around too? Monica smiled bitterly. I'm not your match. Luke chuckled. I won't bully you with my strength. How does that sound? Monica's eyes lit up. Are you serious? When Nikki fought her, she basically crushed her in terms of strength and proficiency, and won in one swoop. Luke had exhibited just as much strength and skill as Nikki. Monica knew very well that if she fought this stronger male version of Nikki, she would only lose more quickly and thoroughly. But if he didn't use his strength to gain the upper hand, and focused on exchanging pointers, she felt that she might not necessarily lose. Luke raised his hand and indicated that they could start in the center of the gym. Monica, however, said with a smile, your last fight was more interesting and more like actual combat. Should we do the same? Luke nodded. Okay, bring it on. As soon as he said, okay, Monica swept out a leg at his ankle. Similarly, Luke aimed a punch at her face. Monica didn't panic. She leaned further back to avoid the attack, but her leg didn't stop moving. Luke stepped forward and seized the opportunity to punch her again. Monica had already finished the sweep with her leg, and it was no longer a threat. The corners of Monica's mouth curled up. Suddenly pushing off of the leg that had just hit the ground, she twisted around to kick Luke in the lower abdomen with her other leg. Luke smiled happily and raised his arm to block it. Monica suddenly pulled her leg back and avoided his arm. She flipped backward 2 meters and stood in place once again. Luke wasn't in a hurry to chase after her. Instead, he smiled and said, you were holding back with that kick, right? That should have been a sneak attack, right? Monica was amused. This is just a private spar, not a knockout competition. If I break you, someone's heart will ache. As she spoke, she glanced at Nikki. Nikki's face, which was red from her earlier exertion, flushed even harder. Mindy rolled her eyes. Thankfully, after that, Luke and Monica stopped joking, and the match officially began. In just 10 seconds, Nikki and Mindy realized that the two of them were evenly matched. Unlike Nikki, who liked to use her strength to suppress her opponent, Monica's advantage was her agility and technique. Luke didn't want to knock her into the wall with his shoulder and turn her to paste, and also just use technique to deal with her. It looked like a kung fu show. But Mindy and Nikki both knew that this wasn't a movie. They were sitting less than 2 meters away, and were combat experts. They had a clear view of the fight, and became even more focused. In all respects, Monica's match was far more exciting than Nikki's. After Luke gave up his strength advantage, a fight based purely on technique was more moving for those who knew how to read it. After all, they weren't fighting to the death. The best was if this sort of spar could enlighten the participants and onlookers, which would be a pleasure. It was the same for Luke. He was even more excited than when he discovered that Nikki was a superhuman. Ever since he obtained the super learning mode, he stopped pursuing combat skills. He could easily kill combat experts with his gun. The more combat experts he killed, the more combat abilities he obtained. After he absorbed a person's skill, he would switch to another person's skill, and constantly build on his own combat ability. Even without placing his full attention on it, he never stopped improving. A new ability that belonged completely to him had already appeared on his list of abilities, elementary combat proficiency. He didn't spend any credit points, nor did he obtain it from some powerful opponent. Just like that, Luke slowly accumulated, optimized and perfected the basic combat abilities of hundreds of people. In fact, Luke had yet to run into an expert who had elementary combat proficiency. But today, he actually discovered a magical existence, Monica. Monica's combat skills far exceeded his expectations. From what Luke could see, he knew that she was at the peak of basic combat. After all, Daddy's system was very picky. The so-called basic combat encompassed everyone on Earth, from professional fighters to those at the peak of their skills. To put it simply, anyone whose ability was between 60 and 99 was judged basic by the system. Technically speaking, people who scored 99 could instantly turn people who scored 60 into scraps, but they were all still basic in the system. As for Luke's elementary combat proficiency, it could be considered a level beyond 100. As someone who had all sorts of basic combat skills, killing a top fighter who scored 99 was a piece of cake. Elementary and basic were completely different levels. The difference in strength was the same as between 5th and 4th generation fighter planes. Monica was a combat expert with more than 90 points. She was one of the best among the 4th generation, but Luke had killed a few people with this level of skill. The truly magical thing was that Monica was actually improving non-stop. As she fought Luke, her combat skills improved rapidly. Luke even had the feeling that as long as she had enough time and practice, he would personally witness the girl become the second Earthling with elementary combat proficiency. But there definitely wasn't enough time today, and it wasn't necessary. 5 minutes later, Luke used his extraordinary reflexes to successfully complete a neck lock. When his strong arms locked around Monica's neck, she knew that she had lost. It wasn't that she was careless, it was just that she couldn't avoid it. Thus, she simply patted her neck twice to indicate that she conceded. She had avoided fighting Luke in close range because she knew that she didn't have the advantage in this regard. After Luke let go, she turned around with a bitter smile. "Did you guess that Nikki and I rarely practice close combat?" Luke shook his head. "No, I just realized that you're afraid of me getting close. It just so happens that I'm very good at melee techniques." Monica was lost for words. He didn't rely on strength to suppress her. Melee combat was also another type of skill, and involved even more complicated and profound techniques. She and Nikki hadn't delved into this area, mainly because they didn't have to use it. Whether it was Nikki's super strength or Monica's excellent skills, they didn't need to use melee techniques when dealing with ordinary men. There were so many vital points on the human body. An accurate hit could cause an ordinary person to fall or die on the spot. Most of the time, the two girls had to do their best to restrain their attacks to avoid killing or crippling their opponents, instead of refining melee skills. After this fight, everyone became even closer. Not only could the weakest of the four of them fight more than 10 people on their own, they were all much stronger than most professional fighters. There were very few in the fighters' circle at this level. For example, Nikki and Monica hardly ever sparred with anyone else other than with each other. Naturally, they weren't well known. As for Luke and Mindy, one was used to blowing heads up with guns, and the other liked to use a double-headed saber. They also didn't have any experience in the fighters' circle. They had now truly become a small clique. Since they weren't that different in age, they could be considered friends, and could chat freely. Mindy finally couldn't take Luke's provocation, and also fought a round with Monica and Nikki each, and the atmosphere in this small clique became even better. Monica wrapped her arms around Mindy's neck, as if she was pressing her to her chest. "It's a good thing Brooks' group has yet to piss you off. Otherwise, they would probably have to be sent to the hospital." Luke asked, "What? Do they like to beat people up?" Monica shook her head. "Not really. Dalton Junior High is still very strict when it comes to this. If they dare hit someone, and it's confirmed that the event happened, they'll have to leave school for sure. However, they don't have any qualms about pushing, shoving and spitting, or pouring juice or coke on someone. Ordinary girls can only endure it, but I don't think Mindy will let herself be bullied." Luke said with a smile, then forget it. If they mess around like that, there are other schools. If Brooke and the others were too much, he would do his best to spread the word about this group of junior high cretins online. Once they became the first infamous group to be crucified on F2F, dropping out of school would be the least of it. Who knew, they might even be sent to a reformation center for a few months. When that happened, these little cretins would learn, even if they didn't want to. After the sparring session, they had afternoon tea at Nikki's place for an hour before Luke and Mindy said goodbye. This time, Nikki got her wish, and Luke promised to train Mindy and the girls for an hour every week. This time, after Luke left, Nikki and Monica didn't bring up any girl talk. As he drove, Luke was all smiles. Hesitating for a moment, Mindy still couldn't help but ask, "Do you like Nikki?" Luke said, "Of course not. We're just ordinary friends." Mindy was surprised. "Then, it's Monica." While there were mixed-race couples, she didn't think Monica was Luke's type. Luke patted her head helplessly. "What are you thinking? They're just friends. I'm not pursuing either of them, okay?" Mindy was relieved. She would have felt conflicted if he was. "You looked very happy, so I thought you were interested in one of them." "Wait, don't tell me you like them together," she suddenly thought of an even worse possibility. Luke couldn't help but rap her head with his knuckles. "Don't you like watching cartoons? Where did you get this idea from?" He didn't say that it was a bad idea. After all, there were too many of these sorts of things in this society, and just as much school. The messy entanglements between cheerleaders and various school team members was the main topic of gossip in every school. Mindy was on the cheerleading team, it was impossible for her not to have heard something like this. He just wanted to change the subject. He couldn't tell the little girl why he was happy, because it was related to the system. "System, you have defeated Nikki Sanderson and have received a list of her abilities." Nikki Sanderson's abilities: Basic Combat, Basic Dance. Elementary Muscle Control, Prerequisites, 20 Strength, 20 Dexterity, 20 Mental Strength, 10,000 credit. System, you have defeated Monica Duane and have received a list of her abilities. Monica Duane's abilities: Basic Combat, Basic Dance. Elementary Imitation, Prerequisites, 20 Strength, 20 Dexterity, 20 Mental Strength, 10,000 credit. Looking at Elementary Muscle Control and Elementary Imitation, Luke was delighted and immediately chose to learn them. Mindy was still in the car, and he couldn't act too happy as he sent her home. When the little girl got out of the car, he didn't forget to remind her, "Remember to tell Damon about making new friends today. Also, show him the video of your training and let him give you some pointers." Mindy nodded helplessly and let Luke rub her head before he drove off. She then complained in a low voice, "Humph, do you think you're really my brother?" With that, she turned around and walked toward the door, her steps gradually becoming lighter. In the end, she was even bouncing up and down. Now, she completely forgot about the 3B asterisk cheese, and only felt that what happened today was very interesting. If this was what it was like to attend school, then she would really have to properly attend school in the future. Muttering to herself, the girl couldn't help smiling. She opened the door and saw Damon in the living room with a pencil and a notebook for sketching. But he seemed a little dazed. Occasionally, he would look at his phone before putting it down. It wasn't until Mindy called out to him that he turned around. The smile on his face immediately disappeared, and he went back to his normal expression. "How was it? Did you have fun?" "Yes. It was a lot of fun." Mindy was happy, and didn't notice her father's subtle expression. She simply smiled and nodded hard. "Oh, right, Luke wants you to have a look at my new friends." Damon's initially conflicted heart was slightly comforted. Good, his daughter hadn't forgotten all about her father after going out to play. He had to calm down and try to get used to the fact that Mindy had classmates and friends, and not just him. A moment later, he was dumbfounded as he watched Mindy and Nikki's ferocious fight on the screen. After a long while, he asked, "Is your friend also?" Mindy naturally knew what her father was thinking. She immediately rolled her eyes. She lives on the Upper West Side. Her father is a senior manager at some company, and her mother is an accountant. Damon was even more surprised. "Indeed, she doesn't act like a killer, but she can actually spar with you." Mindy chuckled. "It's a girls' self-defense club." Damon's face darkened. "Are you kidding me? The men's self-defense club is dead if they piss you off." Mindy wasn't in a hurry, and played the second video after the first one ended. It was a video of her fight against Monica. Damon was now apathetic, and didn't ask the stupid question of whether or not this girl was a killer like them. He knew that his daughter would tell him. That was because Luke telling Mindy to let Damon know was definitely to give Damon the heads up. It would be irresponsible not to let Damon know that such strong friends had appeared next to his daughter. It didn't matter whether Luke had confirmed that the two girls were good or bad, the main thing was that Damon had to confirm it himself. Mindy was his daughter, after all. 20 minutes later, Damon finally heard what happened from his overly excited daughter. He only had one word for it, motherf asterisk cur. It was perfectly normal for his daughter to run into a campus B***tch like Brooke. It was something she would have to face ordinarily, there was no need to make a fuss about it. Mindy's mental fortitude and pride were enough to support her through this uncomfortable period. In the end, it would only be those girls' bad luck. But Luke had pulled strings and turned Nikki and Monica into Mindy's friends, which made Damon's heart ache. Wasn't this supposed to be an ordinary life? How did his daughter go out and casually make friends with two mutuals? He was conflicted, but didn't plan to meddle in his daughter's school life. But he heard that the two girls had worked together to beat up a dozen hoodlums when they were 13 or 14, which was how they became good friends. Now, Mindy and the two girls were hanging out together, and his daughter had beaten up more hoodlums than they had, and was a little resistant to ordinary school life. What was it going to be like when the three girls were together? Damon felt that he had to come up with a contingency plan for the future. He could also call Luke and ask him if he had done it on purpose. Just as Mindy was about to adapt to her new life, why did she suddenly make these two new friends? Soon, Luke received Damon's call while he was on his way to Flushing. He couldn't be bothered to deal with his paranoid father at the moment. He could only clarify with certainty that he had only met the two girls 2 or 3 times before, and he hadn't known that they liked to fight. He had only found them because they happened to be at the same school. After putting down the phone, Damon also felt that he was being a little paranoid. After asking Mindy again, she confirmed that Nikki and Monica had been studying at Dalton Junior High for 3 years and had been cheerleaders for 2 years. Damon had only decided which school to send Mindy to 2 months ago. It was impossible for anyone to arrange for them to approach Mindy beforehand. Damon was relieved. After getting rid of Damon, Luke arrived at Flushing. He parked the car in the police department's parking lot before driving out in the SUV. Stark Expo's official opening ceremony would be held at 7 tonight, and would include a large-scale performance. It was 5 in the afternoon, which was the peak entry time. People and cars turned the place into a sea of noise. New York was still cold in February, and the temperature hovered around 0 degrees, but the atmosphere near the venue was like a furnace. The closer to the venue, the hotter the atmosphere got. The majority of the people all around were no longer adults like during the day, but young people who laughed and joked as they gathered at the venue. They were all here for the performance tonight. What was the most notable trait of Stark Industries? Most people's first reaction was, money. This trait had been endorsed by a certain tycoon for more than 10 years, and was already ingrained in everyone's hearts. Nobody doubted it. A Las Vegas show wouldn't be able to compare with the show tonight. When it came down to it, Las Vegas shows were about making money, while this big show that Stark Industries was putting on, was purely a certain tycoon's interest. Top-notch singers, top-notch dancers, top-notch magicians, and all kinds of top-notch acrobats. The tycoon would never hire anything under a first-class performer. He couldn't afford to lose face. This was a super carnival set up by Stark Industries. Coincidentally, it was also the first day of the Chinese New Year. There had been an increasing number of Chinese in Flushing in recent years, and it was basically equivalent to building another Chinatown here. The lively Chinese New Year celebration was underway at the same time. Although it wasn't in the same area, many people who came to celebrate the Chinese New Year could sense the lively atmosphere. Then, when they entered the venue and saw an even livelier scene, their spirits naturally soared. Many girls who were wearing thick jackets had already tied them around their waists to reveal fair and tan skin alike, which matched the fiery evening. The atmosphere in the car wasn't as lively. After Luke took over the drive, Selena put down the seat and lay down as she said, "These youngsters are even more excited than during the New Year." Luke drove slowly as he patrolled the area. He turned his head and asked, "Are you tired?" Selena said listlessly, "I'm not tired. It's just that patrolling alone is too boring. Gold Nugget can hide in the back and watch TV shows. I only listen to songs at most." Luke was amused. "It's been hard on you. We'll be done with this assignment in 3 days. You can take leave then." Selena asked, "Am I the kind to slack off?" Luke smiled. You're not. I misunderstood you just now. What do you want?" Selena stretched out one hand behind her. Gold Nugget, who had been watching TV, immediately got up, picked up the food box next to it, and gave it to her. Opening the food box, she put on gloves and took out a slice of Napoleon cake. "Tell me, what happened when you went out with Mindy today?" Luke chuckled and told her what happened. From the moment Luke got into the car, Selena knew that he was in a good mood. She and the dog had been on patrol for almost a day, and she needed to listen to something interesting to lift her mood. Luke knew it was a small request, and naturally wouldn't refuse. When Luke told her how strong Nikki and Monica were, Selena forgot to eat the cake. She gaped for a long while before she murmured, "Seriously? How can they be so strong? Wait, do you think they sneak out at night to beat up hooligans?" Amused, Luke shook his head. "They might have beaten up some hooligans before, but it definitely isn't a habit. It would be very hard for them to hide their fighting habits from me, and I've never come across them in our database. Going out at night to beat up hoodlums was also a form of actual combat. As for how important it was to build up good habits in actual combat, just look at Selena." Luke was no longer worried that Selena would lose out if he went too easy on her. Even though she hardly ever killed anyone, the previous knee breaker of LA had turned into New York's Devil Bone Breaker. This upgrade in her title amply demonstrated her progress. It was also because of this that Nikki and Monica, who weren't used to fighting ruthlessly, could only be considered academics. But Luke didn't mention that the two girls had superpowers. He and Selena never discussed sensitive matters outside. Even if his car had pretty solid defenses, it may not help. Who knew if there were superhumans among the tens of thousands of people around them who could eavesdrop on their conversation? Safety first. The more they knew, the stricter they had to be with themselves. They absolutely couldn't relax, or it would be a huge problem. The two of them chatted on the drive. Tens of thousands of people were already cheering at the venue. The performance was about to start. Luke and Selena didn't go over, but simply patrolled areas where there basically weren't any people. They weren't the hard-working patrol officers or support officers. They didn't have to step in to maintain order, nor did they have to face excited fans. As for celebrities, they weren't too interested. Luke had been promoting Claire in various ways on F2F, and she was starting to become an online celebrity singer. Selena, who had witnessed the entire star-making process, lost interest in celebrities. Even the little monkey whom she had trounced in the past could be packaged as a star. Gossip was meaningless to her. Just when they thought they could end today's patrol by taking a spin, an alert suddenly rang out in the car. An unusual flying object is approaching the venue. Luke and Selena looked at the screen on the central console. In the image transmitted by the drone, a shadow was headed for the performance venue, trailing 2 streaks of flames. Both of them exclaimed in surprise. Selena was suspicious. Is this something Tony Stark added to liven things up? Luke, however, dismissed the guess without any hesitation. That's impossible. Unless it's an emergency, that guy would never release such a half-finished product and embarrass himself in front of tens of thousands of viewers. Also, it looks very crude. Selena immediately nodded. That's true. No wonder I find it ugly. If it was Tony's Iron Man armor, it would have to be gorgeous, elegant and classy. It was impossible for it to be big and black. Luke had already gotten out of the car. Notify the other officers and Stark's security to be aware that something might happen at the performance, and to continue maintaining order. Selena said, okay. Of the officers on duty here, she and Luke were probably the only ones who had Happy's number. The real danger was the audience running around in a blind panic and causing a stampede. With tens of thousands of people here, it was too easy for people to be trampled on, causing hundreds of casualties. So, it was best to sort Tony out first and see if they could lure this unknown assailant out of the venue. When Selena started making calls, Luke disappeared into the darkness up ahead. Luke didn't immediately head over. Instead, he put on a pair of lenses as he ran, and looked at the image transmitted by the drone. The thing charging toward the venue looked like a semi-finished suit of metal armor. Crude ports and rivets could be seen on its surface. The metal plates only protected several vital parts. There was no helmet, only a small piece of metal sticking out behind the head. It wasn't as sturdy as Tony's earliest chunky Mark Zero. However, it clearly had a better power system than the crude Mark Zero. It jumped as it advanced, and could jump dozens of meters each time with very economical-looking spurts of flames. Although its speed wasn't half bad, the difference between being able to fly and being able to jump was too great. Tony could fly faster than a Mach 2 plane. Who knew how many times faster he was than this grasshopper-like jumping? This suit was at least several levels lower than Tony's current Iron Man suit. Thinking quickly, Luke turned into a transparent shadow and charged toward the performance venue. On the other side, Selena's call connected quickly. Happy still remembered how Luke and Selena had fought the terrorists in Los Angeles and saved the building. He didn't think that Selena would make a joke about this. Even if it was a joke, Tony could come out later and pull things back on track with a joke or two of his own. The tycoon had mindless fans all over America. If he left halfway through the show, it would be nothing more than a conversation topic, and nobody would criticize him for it. In any case, the tycoon had often done it before he became Iron Man. Nobody could do anything about it. Happy and the security guards rushed onto the stage and dragged Tony away. Unfortunately, it was too late for them to retreat. Just as Tony heard Happy's warning and cooperated with the security guards to retreat, the figure leapt onto the top of a big screen outside the venue. Then, with a tremendous push, flames burst out of his legs as he jumped into the air and then landed on the stage. Just before he landed, the flames on his legs died out, allowing him to land easily. Almost instantly, Tony met the person's gaze, and they spoke at the same time. Tony Stark. Are you looking for me? The man smiled, but his face was stiff, and the long scar under his left eye gave him an intimidating look. He muttered a curse in Russian. The rod-like object in his hands suddenly extended quickly, and in less than 2 seconds, had split and turned into 2 long whips. At the same time, the whips glowed with bluish-white electric light as countless fine electric arcs shot out. The person struck with the whip in his left hand. Dodge! Tony immediately bellowed and pushed Happy away. The security guards subconsciously avoided the attack. It wasn't a problem for them to block bullets for Tony, but this whip didn't look like something that a human could withstand. Crack. With a crisp sound, a thin and deep crack appeared in the ground, smoking faintly. The LCD screen which covered the entire back wall was also split apart, and the screen instantly turned black. An unpleasant smell of burning wafted out. The audience couldn't help but cry out in alarm. But nobody ran. Most people thought that this was a new trick specially designed by Tony. Happy, the box. Tony shouted and waved at Happy even as he ran to the other side. Fat Happy rolled several times over the ground. Seeing the tycoon's action, he understood what he wanted. He rolled a few more times until he was behind a wall. He got up and ran to the red suitcase. The man didn't care about anyone else. He simply walked unhurriedly toward Tony. "Tony Stark, do you know that your family is full of thieves and robbers?" Crack. He lashed out with the whip at Tony, who was slowly retreating. Tony stepped back and avoided the whip. The wall behind him was cut open again. Everybody screamed again, and cameras and titanium phones were held up to record what was going on. In the face of danger, Tony realized that he wasn't too nervous. Compared with Charcoal Head, who looked like a god of combat, the guy in front of him with the whips was just a weak chicken. Luke could easily dodge 2 hits even without wearing the metal armor. Compared with Luke and his rope darts, Tony felt that this guy was just a kindergarten kid. But Tony soon realized that something was wrong. The newcomer didn't seem to be in a hurry to kill him. The 2 whips crackled, but didn't attack repeatedly. Tony was simply forced to jump around as the man mocked his father. There was a short whistle, and out of the corner of his eye, Tony saw Happy in the corridor behind him with a red suitcase in his arms. He was delighted. Fire. As soon as he said that, several security guards who had already raised their guns decisively pulled the triggers. Everything had happened too quickly just now, and they were wary of this attacker who looked like he was wearing metal armor. If the tycoon didn't open his mouth, they didn't dare casually use their weapons, afraid that they might accidentally kill him or injure civilians. But as long as Tony said so, it wouldn't be their responsibility. This was a Stark Industries guarantee. A few bullets were fired at the assailant. The man lashed out with his whips, and more than 10 bullets were deflected. Tony jumped behind the wall and stepped on the red suitcase, which instantly opened. He bent down and stuck his hands into the gloves, then raised the box to his chest. Red and silver armor immediately expanded from the suitcase to cover his upper body. Tony spread his arms and legs in the standard pose. Multiple pieces of armor popped out of the main frame of the suit and quickly combined together. In the end, the silver mask of the helmet flipped down and the eyes glowed white. The entire process only took 5 seconds, and Tony became Iron Man once more. Crack. The wall in front of him was split open by a bluish-white whip. The assailant looked at him through the crack with a sneer, as if he wasn't surprised that he was wearing armor. Tony raised his hand, and the circle in his palm lit up with a cannon blast. The bluish-white whip lashed out again. Tony ducked slightly, and the tip of the whip curved as it struck his wrist from the side. The palm cannon's power-up was immediately interrupted. Tony immediately moved to the side and raised his other hand. After he was thrashed by Batman just 2 days ago, he already knew that he couldn't let the other party grab hold of the rhythm in battle. Attacking from a fixed position wasn't a good thing. Bang! The palm cannon fired, but a whip lashed out almost at the same time. The two collided with a loud explosion, the shock wave rippling outward to kick up a chaotic wind. The assailant, however, was unscathed. He even grinned maliciously as he continued lashing out with his whips. The attack from the palm cannon was a burst of energy, which only lasted for a moment, unlike the whip. The tycoon clearly lacked actual combat experience against superhumans, and was caught off guard as the whip wrapped tightly around him. Jarvis's notifications rang out non-stop, and the internal system was extremely unstable. The assailant's whip was very unique. Its output was converted into plasma energy. Any frail object in its path would naturally be split in two. Tony's metal armor, on the other hand, wasn't that brittle. Even Mark V, which was the most brittle suit, could withstand the damage from the plasma whip for the time being. However, the whip also interfered strongly with the Iron Man armor. Mark V's power output was very unstable, so Tony couldn't immediately break free from the plasma whip. At the same time, the assailant swung the other whip he was holding. The bullets fired by Stark's security guards and the police officers were deflected, flying off to who knew where. Clearly, the whips had a pretty good defense function. The assailant's armor wasn't complete, probably because his most important defense method wasn't the armor. Tony tried to stand up, but his heart suddenly tightened. His vision went blurry and it was difficult for him to breathe. He had just gotten up a little, when his knee hit the ground again. Damn it! His body was actually acting up at a moment like this. After getting the hole in his chest and using the arc reactor to pull away the shrapnel that was close to his heart, he had been suffering palladium poisoning for months. After he was kidnapped last time, he made sure to carry a metal suit with him at all times. He didn't want to be caught off guard and embarrass himself again. In the end, the armor was fine, but there was a problem with his body. If I had Charcoal Head's physique, I could still beat this guy up even if the arc reactor malfunctions. Tony inexplicably thought of the human-shaped monster he had fought previously. He was unwilling to admit defeat again. No way, this guy is so weak, but I'm actually being suppressed. If that guy hears about this, he'll mock me next time. Thinking that, Tony suddenly raised his head, and his eyes lit up, which meant that he was highly focused. Then, there was a flash of white light, and he couldn't help but be stunned. Was he hallucinating? Or was his condition getting worse? Looking at the virtual image in front of his eyes, he saw a dark shadow fall silently and rapidly from the sky. Tony knew who was coming the moment he saw the gliding cape and that stealthy, soundless style. The black shadow swooped down from the sky like a bat hunting for food in the dark. It spun nimbly in the air and passed in between the bluish-white whips to kick the assailant in the back. Bang! The assailant, who had oppressed the tycoon and didn't give him a chance to counterattack, instantly ate sh*t as he rolled 10 meters over the smooth stage. The audience finally realized that someone was here to help Iron Man. They couldn't help but curse out loud, somehow sympathizing with the assailant. After all, most people had never experienced being hit in the face and the butt at the same time, while this assailant had been instantly gratified. On the stage, Tony also noticed that the whip's bluish-white electric light had disappeared. Without this interference, the whips were nothing to the metal armor. He tore off the whip that was wrapped around him and looked over with an upset expression. "Hey, I haven't started getting serious yet. Why did you hit him?" Luke glanced at him and swiped at his waist, sending out a shadow. The assailant, who was about to get up, felt something tighten around him. He lowered his head and saw the rope attached to the black bat dart wrap around him. He flexed his arms and tried to break the rope. Luke appeared in front of the assailant and punched him in the face. The assailant collapsed backward. The audience cheered and yelled out words like "cool," "awesome," and "perfect." Luke grabbed the assailant and sent a communication request to Tony, who looked aggrieved. Tony immediately picked up. "He's here for me. Can't you let me handle it? In any case, I'm done." Luke snorted. This thing in his chest seems to be an arc reactor. It's best to get rid of him quickly, or you'll be in big trouble. Tony turned serious. "I'll have Happy get the car." Luke deliberately asked, "Can't you just fly and take him with you?" Tony was depressed. "My Mark V doesn't have a flight function." Luke gave an "oh," and then said, "Then I'll give you the address later. You can go and get him then." Tony, huh? The next moment, Luke grabbed the assailant and sped across the stage before jumping over the edge. The audience in front of the stage exclaimed in unison and leaned back, as if afraid of being hit. But they soon came back to their senses. Wait, wouldn't it be better if Batman really jumped into their midst? Unfortunately for them, when Luke jumped, his bat cape instantly hardened, and he used the momentum to increase his speed as he flew a huge circle over the heads of the tens of thousands of audience members, and disappeared into the night sky with the assailant. The audience could only raise their heads at the same time and track that figure, like tens of thousands of cats drawn to a cat stick. After the figure disappeared, the scene was silent for a moment, before it suddenly got noisy again. Screaming, whistling, shouting, jumping and hugging, everybody was excited. The audience who had professional cameras and titanium phones were especially excited. Look at what they had taken. This was a bat-slash-iron fight against a supervillain, which was 1,000,000 times better than some performance. They would upload the videos and photos to F2F tomorrow, no, tonight, and say, "I was there, that's me." A few minutes later, Tony left in a hurry. Luke had already returned to the car by then, and continued patrolling with Selina. There was no need to enter the venue. There were tens of thousands of people inside. If things got really chaotic, it would be useless even if they went. It was better to direct traffic around the venue. After all, many people were no longer interested in the official performance after that, and started to leave. Among them, the reporters and other people who had managed to catch the event on camera were the most enthusiastic. Several times, Luke and Selina ran into some people blocking the streets, who turned out to be paparazzi who were collecting all sorts of footage of the scene. Forget about Iron Man and the assailant. Countless cameras had been focused on Tony Stark at the time, and he had been captured on film very clearly. Later, before he could demonstrate his might, Batman beat up the assailant, and there was basically no footage of the battle. Few people present had recorded how Batman had appeared. Iron Man had recently been about to push Batman out of the limelight. Apart from a large number of hardcore fans, many paparazzi and even spectators felt that this made sense. But after Batman appeared again 2 days ago, and with his graceful one-hit takedown of that supervillain tonight, many people came back to their senses. This was the #1 superhero. This was Batman. He was known as the Black Angel and was like a saint. If Tony Stark satisfied the public's fantasy of a superhero, then Batman undoubtedly fulfilled the public's expectations of a superhero. Apart from punishing evil and advocating good, Batman didn't do anything else, and didn't have much exposure. Many people felt that Batman's name probably didn't come from his appearance, but because this superhero only appeared at night to stop crime, and never accepted the people's worship under the sun. Batman only felt pride in his heart. He was great, but also lonely. What the tens of thousands of excited people at the scene didn't know was that at that moment, a minor detective was working diligently outside the venue, and was issuing a huge ticket to a guy who had parked randomly. From the paparazzo who had stopped his car randomly in chasing down news, a certain person discovered that this TV station had recently come up with a lot of bat-slash-iron CP material. A certain detective decisively took advantage of his position to give NYPD a small windfall. Selina's expression was unperturbed, as if the two of them were patrolling diligently. As for them switching to issuing parking fines, she was well aware that this was just looking for people to act as witnesses. They were the first to discover the assailant, but hadn't entered the venue to provide backup. They could use the excuse that there hadn't been enough time. After all, the attack had happened and ended too quickly. Most of the security guards and police officers in the venue hadn't even reached the stage yet. If Luke never showed his face, it was a small failing. The surveillance cameras and parking fines issued outside the venue were their best cover. They were busy until 10 at night. After working overtime, they drove home. Luke then left through the underground passage and went to an old warehouse in New Jersey. He released the assailant from Space 2. Using various detection equipment in his inventory, he scanned the assailant and his equipment before sending Tony the address. After sending the message, he didn't hang around, and left. He didn't question the man or take anything that belonged to the assailant. This assailant might be valuable to others, but Luke wasn't as affected since the system had already taken most of his value. System: defeat and capture Ivan Vanko. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 200. Total credit, 200. Contribution rate, 90%. EXP plus 180. Credit plus 180. Luke was quite surprised by the system notification. As a classic bad guy with suspected knockoff Iron Man armor, and who spouted a lot of supervillain lines, Ivan was only worth 200 points. He was simply a disgrace to villains. Also, according to the experience and credit points from this mission, he probably hadn't come here to hurt anyone except Tony Stark. Also, while he was tagged as evil in the system, it was the lightest shade of red. Light red meant minor evil, and the level of danger was on par with a standard hooligan. Anyone who stole things or sold weed more often would be included. Coupled with the 200 points assigned by the system, this meant that this Ivan actually wasn't too bad. He had just done some bad things at most, which was really unexpected. So, instead of killing him, Luke decided to hand him over to Tony. Of course, experience and credit were just one of the gains. The other reward was the list of abilities which he had obtained after defeating Ivan. This Ivan Vanko had most of Stark's abilities, but some weren't very strong. However, after Luke switched over to Ivan's abilities, he found information on this knockoff Iron Man armor, including the energy source which looked like an arc reactor. In fact, it was indeed an arc reactor, but had a low RPM and low output. The main reason for this problem was that Ivan didn't have that much money to perfect the armor. It was also the reason why the armor could only jump, and why it was incomplete. Without enough money, he wouldn't be able to build a powerful energy core, so it had many reduced functions. The most outstanding thing about this armor was the 2 plasma whips, which proved that he wasn't just a copycat, but an expert. What was even more amazing was that Ivan's armor was pure DIY, and he was very poor. The raw materials that went into this semi-finished armor cost only about $1 million, yet he had been able to drive Tony into a tight spot with it. If he had $100 million to spend on the armor, the final product wouldn't be much worse than Tony's Iron Man suit. But after what happened today, there was no need to mention how troublesome things would be for Tony, let alone the trouble Ivan was in. The main thing was that the energy core was too much like an arc reactor. Coupled with Luke's Batman suit 2.0, it was clear that he had gathered together the basic elements for the Iron Man suit. A few days ago, Tony had refused to hand over the Iron Man suit and all the related technology at a hearing in Congress. In the end, an assailant in a semi-finished suit appeared, which was D***MN awkward. The people from Congress had just been slapped in the face. Now that there was an opportunity, they would force the tycoon to hand his armor over once again. Luke simply mentioned this possibility in his message to the tycoon, and told Tony to be careful. But it probably wouldn't be long before all the viewers in America saw the tycoon on TV again. As for the conflict between Tony and Ivan, he didn't really care. Tony had enough money and influence to clearly investigate everything. News channels all over America blew up again tonight. There was a huge amount of breaking news, and the live witnesses on F2F were having a huge party. It was different this time. When Tony beat up Obadiah, S.H.I.E.L.D. blocked the news. There had never been a scene of the 2 Iron Mans fighting each other on TV, let alone of Batman and Iron Man's fight. Now, the first big fight, of the Bat/Iron CP versus the supervillain, was about to air, and everybody went crazy. All Iron Man did was either dodge or fall to his knees, and the assailant, Whiplash, was taken down and tied up with one move from Batman. Even if the entire battle took less than a minute, it didn't reduce the significance of this sensational moment. That was because the key factors of superheroes, supervillains, superheroes working together, and the supervillain being defeated had all come to life. It was a real-life superhero comic strip. Some viewers clamored for more. For example, who was the boss of the superheroes? On this point, Batman and Iron Man's brainless fans launched all sorts of debates, and the hardcore keyboard warriors even stayed up late to support their heroes. But Iron Man and Batman clearly had a special relationship. Both parties made their debut at the same time, and saved a lot of victims during the California earthquake. This was a good deed that couldn't be disputed and used to judge who was better. The second time they appeared together was when Batman visited Iron Man at night a few days ago, and the two of them went to Staten Island for a bout. This could only prove that they were close, but not who was better. It wasn't until their third appearance together, in Iron Man's encounter with Whiplash, that Batman kicked Whiplash away in a critical moment. This once again proved that they were close, and also that Batman was a little better. But Iron Man fans could argue that Tony hadn't been wearing the main suit. There was a lot of debate on the internet, but for the time being, nobody stepped on the other party's favored superhero to talk up their own fave. And so, a third evil force appeared. They believed that the best outcome for Batman and Iron Man was, to be together. These heretics were then instantly attacked by the loyal fans on both sides. The men who liked them acknowledged their actions and regarded them as heroes, and fantasized about becoming like them. Most women who liked them wanted to meet and fall in love with them someday, like She-Ra. But, together. The fans in all three parties were very resolute, and nobody could convince anyone else. At that moment, Tony was busy trying to get Ivan back to see if his Iron Man technology had been leaked. Luke was busy checking the man's abilities and testing them to see if they could be incorporated into his own armor. The people involved were too busy to follow the news. The next day, Luke and Selina went to the expo as usual. What happened last night didn't affect the expo. Instead, even more people poured into the place. Most people went to the stage first to admire it. If they didn't see for themselves the scene of Iron Man and Batman's battle, they felt that something was missing. Thanks to these people, Luke and Selina threw more than 20 people into the detention center in the morning to calm down, and Luke earned 100 experience and credit points. When they were having lunch in the car, Selina casually asked if they were going to visit the independent booths today, and Luke slapped his forehead. "I forgot about Bent." Selina found that odd. "His items don't seem." Wait, it seems they might be useful to us." Luke winked at her and said, "Haven't you always been saying that something feels missing when you're out on an assignment?" They were naturally talking about how Selina complained that her attack methods were too simple when she was out on her private job. Now, with Bent's inventions, New York's nightlife would definitely be a lot more interesting. Luke took out his fake phone and gave an order online to a certain shell company. At that moment, Bent was driving his shabby car home with a dejected expression. He couldn't afford to live in New York, nor on this side of the Hudson River in New Jersey. After several months of unemployment, he could only stay at his mother's place in Secaucus, New Jersey for the time being. It wasn't unusual for unemployed middle-aged people to go home and eat their 70-year-old mother's cooking. Of course, whether or not she was willing was another matter. Bent's mother wasn't too unhappy about him losing his job, but she was very dissatisfied with how he had never even looked for a girlfriend. Thinking about how not only didn't he make any money this time, he would still be despised by his mother for not having a girlfriend, Bent felt that his days were dark. It was a small thing to not have a girlfriend, but what if he ran out of money for research? It was already good enough that his mother gave him enough of her pension for him to live on, he couldn't ask for more. Did he really have to find a job as a researcher, follow the arrangements of those dumb *SS higher-ups and forever carry out boring research? Bent fell into despair. Even when his phone suddenly rang, he only glanced at it. When he saw that it was an unknown number, he was uninterested in picking up. Was someone calling to buy his inventions? That was impossible. Since yesterday, apart from one phone call from his mother, it was either someone selling something or a wrong number. But the unknown number was persistent, and rang 7 or 8 times. Bent stepped on the brake angrily and picked up the call. "Damn it. I'm not buying insurance, condoms, bank products, cheap phones, or whatever. I'm so poor I have to eat sh*t. Do you want to eat it too? I'll send you a few kilograms and it comes out to fill the mouths of you'd *mn salespeople. There was a dead silence on the other end. The other party probably hadn't expected Bent to be so moody. A few seconds later, a polite voice rang out. Hello, is this Mr. Bent Bennett? After venting his anger, Bent was breathing heavily. Be ****, I don't want a credit card either. I'm bankrupt now. The voice on the other end was still polite and formulaic. It seems that you need a job, right? Bent was stunned. A job? I didn't submit a resume. The person on the other end of the line laughed. It's fine. Work which comes knocking on your door is always a good thing, Mr. Bennett. Just like that, Bent sat in the car and stayed on the line for half an hour. As the conversation went on, his expression got better and better. In the end, he hung up and couldn't be any more excited. He couldn't help but rush out of the car and raise his hands to the sky. Ha ha ha, I have a job. I have money. A luxury car drove past him, and the girl in the car looked at him curiously. Mom, what's wrong with him? The lady snorted. It's fine. It's just another lunatic. In the meantime, Luke looked at the text message from the lawyer whom the shell company had hired. He turned around with a smile. I bought out the inventions for $500,000. His annual salary will be $200,000, plus 5% from any patents. He signed on for 50 years. Satisfied? Selina thought for a moment. Not bad, but isn't 50 years too long? Luke shrugged. Why else did he stipulate a $10 million penalty fee? He's not really an idiot. He just likes to play with technology more. We don't expect his inventions to make money. Selina said, then can't we just buy his current technology? He still wants to sell it, right? Luke said, no one in the Department of Defense likes this guy, and he has very little resources. However, if I give him a research budget of $1 to $10 million a year, do you think he won't be able to come up with some new and interesting tech? After thinking about it, Selina had to agree with him. What Luke didn't say was that the long-term investment was for Selina. She wasn't someone who killed indiscriminately. Whether she was a detective or a vigilante, the only type of person she would kill without hesitation was a scumbag like Kilgrave. Luke didn't plan for her to change her habit. Everybody had the right to be themselves. He couldn't think that Selina was wrong just because she wasn't as straightforward as he was. Without the system, he might have made a similar choice. But Luke had always felt that letting certain people live was also a form of punishment, provided that they didn't live too comfortably. And Bent's little toys were very good in this respect. With some of them, the longer their effects lasted, the better. For example, big shots who couldn't stop farting for a week would lose all dignity. By the same logic, the itching powder and cramping oil wouldn't kill anyone, but could make it basically impossible for a person to get any work done. It would be especially hard for gang big shots to look formidable and intimidate their subordinates. Thinking about how there would be New York legends in the future of big shots who farted, cramped or itched, Luke was full of anticipation. There was a story from his previous life that he always remembered. My neighbor's brother had always been a school tyrant, and no one dared defy him. One day, he was fighting, and took out from his pocket the magical girl transformation rod which his sister played with. Clearly, the best policy was to torture a man's heart. 2 days later, Luke and Selina were finally released from patrol duty. Except for the attack at the opening ceremony, everything went smoothly at the expo. Even though more than 2,000 people had been stuffed into the detention center which Stark Industries had just donated to the police department, it still had to be said that this had been a successful, peaceful, and productive expo. Luke was also roused from the joy of obtaining Tony and Ivan's new abilities, and he refocused on Nikki and Monica's abilities. Neither elementary muscle control nor elementary imitation were particularly strong. But on the same person, the two abilities played off each other very well. Take Nikki and Monica, for example. An ordinary person with a combo of these two abilities could easily kill 3 to 5 pairs of Nikki and Monica. Elementary muscle control was the hardware, and elementary imitation was the software. Elementary muscle control was a combat technique which one had to learn and hone themselves. Elementary imitation couldn't be fully utilized when it was limited by a person's physique. Combining both, on the other hand, was combining strength and technique, and could create close-range combat ability that was close to Luke's level. Now that Luke had these two abilities, he discovered after some rough research that they were even more useful than he had imagined. For him, the biggest shortcoming was that his physique wasn't good enough, which restricted his use of his abilities. Luke, who had 40 strength, 27 dexterity and 40 mental strength, also had elementary self-healing, quick reflex, and physical outburst. He could easily carry out movements that ordinary people couldn't, and he wasn't afraid of injuring himself when he tested elementary muscle control. Except for the fact that it hurt more frequently, it wasn't a big problem. He turned this muscle control, which was initially a trump card, into a regular skill. Nikki called it explosion, but Luke preferred to call it berserk. This trump card was similar to physical outburst, except that it was more like an increase in strength. It had a similar side effect, which was hidden physical injuries. There were a lot of possibilities in combining berserk with physical outburst. Luke felt that as long as he studied and honed this combo for a while, it might turn into a new ability. Even when muscle control wasn't used in explosion, it could make minute adjustments to his movements so that his muscles could support difficult movements, thus significantly increasing his combat ability. Lastly, it had another support function. With a bit of focus, Luke could change the shape of his muscles to a certain extent, whether it was his face or his body. In other words, even without the 1,000 faces system, he could instantly change his appearance. He couldn't turn into someone else's face, but it was very easy to make his face unrecognizable. It could be said that muscle control was a multifunctional, divine skill that was far more useful than he had expected. But it still couldn't compare with Monica's elementary imitation. Elementary imitation sounded very simple, it allowed a person to quickly imitate the movements of others. At first glance, it didn't look like a big deal, but when this quick imitation was applied to increasing proficiency in minutes and not days, this skill was far more magical than elementary muscle control. Take Monica, for example. If other people took a year to learn Taekwondo, it only took her 3 to 5 days, the only difference was in combat awareness and physique. She didn't even need to personally make a move, she just needed to watch a live demonstration a few times from the side to completely understand these movements. She knew exactly how to exert force and coordinate her movements. She was pretty much as fast as a copy. But similar with elementary muscle control, the real limitation of this ability was the person themselves. Without enough combat awareness and a good enough physique, it was impossible for a fat homebody to suddenly do a spin in the air and land steadily, even if he knew every step of the process. This ability was more like a magnifier, which made all physical movements simpler. It just so happened that Luke had enough combat awareness and experience, and a body far stronger than an ordinary person's. With Nikki and Monica's respective abilities, their combat ability increased several-fold. As for Luke, who had a combo of the two abilities, his combat ability wasn't the only thing that increased, he also now had a chance to turn the impossible into the possible. He was proficient in various cold weapons, firearms, and extreme parkour, but without enough training, it was hard for him to perform everything at the same time. Naturally, that was no longer a problem. With his strong physique, the two new abilities, and a vast trove of basic skills, he would become an expert in most combat-related skills after 3 to 5 days of training. He would be able to not only learn, but also master more unusual skills like the spear, bow and arrows, horse riding, skiing and so on. It could be said that from the moment he obtained these two perfectly matched abilities, Luke was absolutely certain that he would become a combat master. Also, this combat master would be on a cosmic scale, and not limited to Earth. His elementary combat proficiency was already at the peak on Earth. Except for a few mysterious big shots whom he had only heard of, he wasn't worried about anything else. If Luke was given a few years, there wouldn't be many people in the universe who could beat him in pure combat. As with any job or industry, the higher up you went, the fewer people there were. If there were a dozen people on Earth who were proficient in elementary combat, there might only be dozens of aliens in the entire universe who were proficient in intermediate combat. As for advanced combat proficiency, it was hard to say if this ability existed. The God of Thunder was a good example. Even this Asgardian god, who had lived for thousands of years, wouldn't waste his energy on too many combat skills. He only needed to choose one or two that were the most suitable for him, like advanced one-handed hammer proficiency, and then obtain a suitable, divine weapon, to unleash his greatest combat ability. There was no need to work on all his combat skills. As long as Thor had the Mjolnir hammer and combined it with his advanced one-handed hammer proficiency, it would be hard for Luke to defeat him without a special, divine weapon. This was the typical question of whether it was better to be a jack of all trades or master of one. Luke's advantage was Daddy System's Super Learning Mode, which was his first cheat. Next, he had these two new abilities. Not only did they allow him to unleash 100% or 200% of his strength, he would be able to quickly learn the other party's movements in a fight. This was equivalent to a second cheat. The reaction between the two wasn't a combination, but a multiplication, or even an exponential increase, so he didn't have to spend a lot of time specializing in combat. If he used a hammer, he wouldn't be inferior to Thor, nor to Captain America if he used a shield, or to Hawkeye if he used a bow. For Luke, none of this was a dream any longer. After figuring out these two abilities, Luke couldn't help but rub his chin and murmur, "I still have to properly thank Nikki and Monica. In the future, I'll ask them what dreams they have, and try to help them achieve it." He had always felt that even if other people didn't know about the system acquiring abilities, he himself couldn't act like it was nothing. Since he had chosen to kill bad guys for experience and credit points, he should be generous in his thanks to the people who helped him. That was his own sense of fairness. Otherwise, based on how the system judged things, he could kill bad guys without guilt, but he wouldn't have a clear conscience when obtaining benefits from innocent people. For example, Luke had pulled some strings to help Alicia's mother find a job after Alicia provided him with Sharp Nose in Houston. They didn't know, however, that it was Luke who had done it. Thanks to the girl's gratitude, he acquired Sharp Nose, this divine skill, at the very beginning. Whether in cracking cases or gathering credit points, this ability played an unimaginably vital role. So, he would make sure that the little girl, Alicia, lived a comfortable life. If she had some skills when she grew up, and wanted to make a fortune, he was willing to secretly invest in her. He treated everyone the same, like Carol and Tony, and would pay them all back. Only then would he feel at ease.